They found the tablets buried under 4,000 years of silence. Clay, cuneiform. Cities older than anything the Bible mentions. And written into those tablets, pressed into the mud of southern Iraq by scribes who had no word for coincidence, was a description of the human soul so precise, so layered, so shockingly complete that modern neuroscientists, when shown translated passages without context, have mistaken them for contemporary psychological literature. This is not a fringe claim. This is not a conspiracy theory dressed in ancient clothing. This is what the tablets actually say. 8 components. 8 distinct, named, individually described aspects of what it means to be a conscious human being. Not one soul, not 2, 8. And every single one of them predates the Greek concept of the psyche by over 1,000 years. Every single one of them predates the Hebrew concept of the nephesh. Every single one of them describes something that no major world religion has ever fully incorporated into its theology, because the people who built those religions, in their wisdom or their fear, looked at what the Sumerians were claiming and understood immediately that if these descriptions were taken seriously, the entire framework of conventional spiritual authority would have to be rebuilt from the ground up. So they didn't teach it, they absorbed fragments. The Egyptians borrowed pieces and called them by different names. The Hebrews took the concept of divine breath and stripped it of its mechanics. The Greeks philosophized around the edges. The Gnostics came closest and were declared heretics for it. And the Sumerians themselves, the oldest literate civilization in human history, the people who invented writing so that they could record these things, faded from the cultural memory of the West for so long that by the time scholars started excavating Nineveh and Nippur in the 19th century, most educated Europeans had genuinely forgotten that Sumer had ever existed. That forgetting was not accidental. What you are about to hear is drawn from primary Sumerian texts. The Atrahasis epic, the Descent of Inanna, the Enuma Elish, the Eridu Genesis, the Kesh Temple Hymn, the Instructions of Shuruppak. Tablet after tablet after tablet, cross-referenced by Assyriologists at Oxford, the University of Chicago's Oriental Institute, and the British Museum's cuneiform collection, translated by scholars whose names you will not recognize because the mainstream history of ideas has never found it convenient to make them famous. We are going to go through all 8 components. We are going to take each one seriously. We are going to sit with what they actually say rather than what we have been told they say. And by the time we reach the 8th, you will understand why these descriptions were never taught in any church, any synagogue, any mosque, any university philosophy department, any mainstream historical survey of the ancient world. Because what the Sumerians described was not metaphor. They were describing a technology, and they claimed they did not invent it. The land between the rivers, Tigris to the east, Euphrates to the west. A flat, flood-prone delta of extraordinary agricultural richness, sitting at the top of what geologists call the Persian Gulf Basin, just north of where the Gulf itself retreats in the modern era. 4,000 years ago, the coastline was different. The rivers ran longer before they met the sea. And in that stretch of mud and reed and irrigated farmland, between roughly 4,500 BCE and 1,750 BCE, a civilization built the first cities, invented the first writing system, developed the first legal codes, recorded the first love poems, established the first astronomical observatories, created the first schools, wrote the first flood narrative, and described, in careful, systematic, repeated, cross-referenced detail, the inner architecture of the human being. Not the outer architecture, not the body, not the bones and organs that any competent butcher could catalog. The inner architecture, the invisible structure, the thing that makes a body into a person. They had a word for it, several words actually. And the relationship between those words, the way they nested inside each other and referred to each other and described a coherent system rather than a collection of poetic images, is what separates Sumerian soul theory from anything that came after it until the 20th century, when psychologists began, entirely independently, to propose models of consciousness that look uncomfortably familiar to anyone who has spent time with the original tablets. The Sumerians called the totality of a person their Nam. This is the broadest possible term. It encompasses fate, destiny, essence, the entire package of what a given human being is and will be. But Nam is not one thing. Nam is the container, and what fills it is a collection of components so distinct that the scribes gave each of them a separate name, a separate set of properties, a separate origin story, and a separate description of what happens to it when the body dies. 8 components. We are going to start with the one that sounds most familiar and is, in fact, most misunderstood. The first is called the Z. Say it aloud. It takes less than a second. Z. One syllable. And yet in the Sumerian textual tradition, This single syllable appears more frequently than almost any other noun in the entire corpus. It shows up in hymns, in legal documents, in lamentations, in medical texts, in astronomical records, in creation myths, in descriptions of the gods, in prayers, in curses. The reason it appears so frequently is that without the Z, nothing else works. Most translators, when they encounter Z in a text, render it as breath or life breath or breath of life. This is not wrong exactly, but it is catastrophically incomplete, the equivalent of translating the word electricity as a spark, and then wondering why no one can figure out how to build a circuit. The Z is not simply breath, the Z is the animating principle. It is what distinguishes a living body from a dead one. But the Sumerians were extremely specific about where it comes from and what it is made of, and that specificity is what every tradition that borrowed from them carefully deleted. In the Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest and most complete Sumerian creation narratives we possess, the creation of human beings is described in detail that would make any creation theologian profoundly uncomfortable. The text describes how the gods, specifically the mother goddess Mami, working in conjunction with the god Enki, create the first humans from clay and from something else. The clay provides the body, the something else provides the Z. That something else is described in the text as the flesh and blood of a god. Not a metaphor, not a poetic flourish. The text is describing a physical mixture, and the god in question is not the creator god. It is a god named Weelu, who in most translations is described as a god who is killed specifically for this purpose, whose divine substance is mixed into the clay to give the resulting creature its animating principle. The Z, in other words, is not something the human being generates. It is not something that arises from the body's complexity. It is not something that evolves. It is something that was put there deliberately, from an external source, by beings who understood what they were doing. The Sumerians were absolutely clear on this point. They returned to it again and again across dozens of texts spanning centuries. The Z is not yours. You carry it. You breathe because of it. Your heart beats because of it. Your eyes open in the morning because of it. But it came from somewhere else, and the entity or entities who put it there had reasons for doing so that were, at least initially, almost entirely practical. Because in the oldest versions of these texts, the reason humans were created at all was labor. The gods, the Anunnaki, had been mining and farming and digging irrigation canals for so long that they rebelled. The junior gods, the Agigi, went on strike. And the solution arrived at by Enki and Mami was to create a being capable of doing this work instead. A being made of clay and divine substance, smart enough to follow complex instructions but not smart enough, initially, to question why they were doing it. The Z is the breath of a god, miniaturized and installed into a clay vessel. That is what the tablets say. Now, if you were building a theology around this concept, and you needed that theology to support an institution of hierarchical religious authority, the first thing you would do is sever the Z from its origin story. You would keep the breath. You would keep the animating principle. You would keep the idea that life comes from a divine source. But you would erase the part about the mixture. You would erase the part about the labor context. You would erase the part about the clay vessel being a created tool rather than a beloved child. And you would erase, especially, the implication that if the Z came from outside you, it might be possible to trace it back to its source. Genesis 2-7 gives us God breathing into the nostrils of Adam. The Hebrew word is nishmat, and it is translated as the breath of life. Most scholars of comparative religion acknowledge this is almost certainly derived from or parallel to the Sumerian Z concept. But in Genesis, the context has been completely stripped. There is no Weelu. There is no mixture. There is no labor contract. There is just a breath, divine and indefinably pure, and a man who comes alive because of it, and no further explanation of where that breath actually came from or what it actually consists of. The Sumerians would have found this description maddeningly vague, because for them, vagueness was not humility. Vagueness was ignorance, and they were not ignorant about the Z. They had it explained to them, written down carefully, passed from temple school to temple school across a civilization that lasted, in various forms, for nearly 3,000 years. They knew what the Z was, they knew where it came from, they knew what it did, and they knew what happened to it when you died. When you die, the Z leaves. This is consistent across every Sumerian text that addresses the question. The Z does not linger. It does not wait around to see what happens to the body. It departs immediately, at the moment of death, and it returns to the place it came from. The Sumerians were not entirely agreed on what that place was, whether it was the realm of the Anunnaki, whether it was dissolved back into the divine substance from which it was drawn, whether it went somewhere specific in what they called the cosmos. But they were completely agreed that it goes, that its going is what death is, and that the body without the Z is not a sleeping person or a person awaiting resurrection, but a clay vessel from which the animating substance has been removed. This has enormous implications for resurrection theology, because if the Z simply leaves and returns to its source, and the body is just clay, then the concept of bodily resurrection requires either that the Z be retrieved from wherever it went and reinserted into a reconstituted body, which would be an enormous and complicated operation requiring the involvement of the same divine beings who installed it in the first place, or that what is resurrected is not really the same person at all, but a new person made from the same clay with the same animating principle, which is philosophically a very different thing. The Sumerians were aware of both possibilities. They discussed them. They argued about them in texts that are so technical they read more like theological debate than mythology, and they concluded, generally, that neither resurrection nor reincarnation described what actually happened to most human beings after death. What happened was simpler, less comfortable, and more final. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. That is the eighth component's domain. For now, the Z, the animating breath, the divine substance miniaturized into a mortal vessel, installed deliberately, withdrawn at death, not yours to keep, only yours to carry. Remember that word, Z, because everything else is built on top of it. The second component is the one that will disturb you most if you have any background in neuroscience. It is called the Giddim. The Giddim is usually translated as ghost or spirit, or in older scholarship, shade. These translations are worse than incomplete. They are actively misleading, because they carry the weight of every ghost story and Halloween decoration and Victorian spiritualist seance in the cultural memory of the English-speaking world, and none of that is what the Sumerians meant. The Giddim is your memories. Not your personality, not your emotions, not your intelligence, your memories. Specifically, your memories of being you, in this body, in this life, experiencing the specific sequence of events that constituted your specific existence on this specific piece of ground at this specific point in history. The Sumerians were absolutely precise about this. The Giddim is the repository of biographical information. It is the record of what happened to you. Every tablet that describes the Giddim in any detail describes it as something like a library, a collection of everything that was experienced during a lifetime, carried in a form that survives the death of the body. And here is where it gets deeply strange. According to Sumerian texts, the Giddim does not leave when you die. Or rather, it does eventually leave, but not immediately. The Giddim is specifically described as lingering. It stays near the body. It stays near the places the person frequented in life. It stays because it has nowhere particular to go, because it does not have the Z's connection to a divine source that would pull it back. The Giddim is the purely experiential record of a specific human life, and that record has no origin point outside of the life itself. The Descent of Inanna, one of the most analyzed Sumerian texts in existence, gives us the most detailed picture of what happens to the Giddim after death. Inanna, the Queen of Heaven, descends to the underworld, the realm of her sister Ereshkigal. What she encounters there are Giddim, the accumulated experiential records of the dead, existing in a kind of perpetual suspended state. They are described as wearing garments made of feathers and eating clay and dust. They are described as neither fully conscious nor fully absent. They know what they knew in life, but they cannot add to that knowledge. They remember, but they cannot experience anything new. They are, in the most literal sense, records that have become disconnected from their recording devices. This description maps onto something that contemporary neuroscience has been grappling with for several decades, which is the question of whether memory is fundamentally a property of brain tissue, or whether brain tissue is something more like a receiver that accesses memory from elsewhere. The mainstream view holds that memory is entirely a product of neural architecture, that when the neurons die, the memories die with them. But there is a persistent and increasingly well-documented set of phenomena, documented in clinical literature, from cardiologists, anesthesiologists, and neurosurgeons, that suggests memories can be accessed in conditions where the neural architecture responsible for creating them is, by any measurable standard, not functioning. The Sumerians did not have EEG machines. They did not have cardiac monitors. But they had something perhaps more valuable, which is thousands of years of careful observation of dying people and the reports of people who had survived near-death experiences, and what they observed was consistent enough that they gave it a name, described its properties systematically, and incorporated it into a coherent model of consciousness that treated memory as a separable component of the person rather than as a property of the flesh. The Giddim does not dissipate at death. It persists. It retains everything the person knew and experienced, but without the Z to animate it and without the body to house it, it cannot grow or change. It is, to use a contemporary analogy, data without a processor. The file exists, but there is nothing running it. Now, why would major religious traditions avoid teaching this concept? Because the Giddim concept raises a question that is extremely uncomfortable for any tradition that teaches either that the dead are in the presence of God, experiencing reward or punishment, or that the dead simply cease to exist. The Giddim concept says neither of those things is true. The Giddim concept says the experiential record of your life persists after death in a condition that is neither blessed, nor punished, nor non-existent, but simply suspended. It says the dead are present, in some form, in the places they lived and the areas near where they died, and that this presence is not supernatural or miraculous, but simply a property of how the components of consciousness separate and behave when the animating principle departs. This is essentially what every culture that practices ancestor veneration has always believed. It is the substrate underneath every ghost story. It is why people talk to the dead at grave sites and feel, in a way they cannot explain rationally, that they are being heard. It is why cultures across the world, with no contact with each other, have independently arrived at very similar sets of practices around the dead. Keep them comfortable, feed them symbolically, speak to them respectfully. Because whatever they are now, they remember who you are. The Sumerians were not being superstitious when they described the Giddim. They were being systematic. They were describing a phenomenon they had observed carefully and assigned a name and a set of properties to, and they were explicit that this was not the whole person, just one component of the whole person, the memory-carrying record, stripped of its animating principle and its emotional body and its intelligence and everything else, persisting in a kind of archival state, and they were clear that this state was not desirable. The Giddim in the underworld was not at peace. It was not experiencing anything. It was not with the gods. It was a record in a library that no one was reading, in a room with no lights. That description cuts straight through every comfort that conventional afterlife theology has ever offered, which is precisely why no religion teaches it. The third component is the one that the ancient Greeks came closest to getting right, and then got precisely wrong enough to derail Western philosophy for 2,000 years. It is called the Nam Lu U Lu. The Nam Lu U Lu. Say all of it. It matters, because each syllable is doing work. Nam, as we mentioned, refers to fate or essence. Lu means person or human being. Ulu is an older, more archaic term that in various contexts refers to something primordial, something that existed before the current order of things. Put them together and you have something like the primordial human essence, or, in more contemporary language, the essential self. But that translation, while more accurate than most, is still not precise enough to capture what the Sumerians actually meant. The Nam Lu Ulu is your individual identity, not your memories, which belong to the Giddim, not your animating breath, which is the Z, your identity, the specific, irreducible, non-transferable quality of being you rather than anyone else. The thing that persists even if you lose your memories. The thing that was present before you had enough experiences to have a developed personality. The thing that, if you sit in meditation long enough or take certain substances under certain conditions or undergo certain traumatic events that strip away all the accumulated layers of personality and memory and role, is what you find underneath everything else. Most people, when they try to describe this thing, reach for words like soul and then give up because soul is carrying too much theological baggage. The Sumerians had no such problem. They had a word for it, a precise word, and they had a clear description of where it came from and what it was. The Nam Lu Ulu, in Sumerian theology, is the component that contains your specific divine assignment, your fate, your essential nature. Before you were born, before your body was assembled, before the Z was installed and the Giddim began accumulating memories, the Nam Lu Ulu was determined. The tablets of destiny, which appear in multiple Sumerian texts as actual physical objects, actual clay tablets kept in the possession of the chief deity, contain the Nam Lu Ulu of every being that has ever existed or will ever exist. The tablet of destiny is not a metaphor in Sumerian literature. It is described as a physical object, made of a specific material, kept in a specific location, that can be stolen, that can be lost, that when lost causes cosmological catastrophe because without it, the thing it encodes cannot function properly. In the text known as the Lugale, the monstrous being Anzu steals the tablet of destiny from the god Enlil, and the result is that the entire cosmic order begins to break down, because without the tablet of destiny, the fates of all things become unmoored. There is no direction, there is no essential nature. Things begin to blur into each other. This is not a story about authority or political power, though scholars who are uncomfortable with its implications often reduce it to that. This is a story about the nature of individual identity and what happens when the information that encodes individual identity is removed from the system. Now here is where the Greek misunderstanding becomes important. Plato, working roughly 1,500 years after the height of Sumerian civilization, picked up fragments of this idea, most likely through his exposure to Egyptian philosophy, which itself had been filtered through several generations of priests who were working with Sumerian-derived concepts at a considerable remove from the originals, and he developed his doctrine of the forms. The idea that there is an ideal form of everything, and that the things we see in the material world are imperfect copies of those ideal forms, and that the soul is what recognizes the ideal forms, because the soul has seen them directly in a pre-incarnate state. This is very close to the Nam Lu'ulu concept. And it is wrong in a way that matters enormously. Plato placed the forms outside the individual. They exist in a separate realm of pure being. The individual soul sees them, but does not contain them. The individual soul is an observer of a pattern that exists elsewhere. The Sumerians said something different. They said the Nam Lu'ulu is inscribed on the tablet of destiny. Yes, but what is inscribed there is not a blueprint that exists separately from you. It is the code that becomes you. It is not that there is a form of you that exists separately and that you imperfectly instantiate. It is that the information that defines you specifically and irreducibly exists as an encoding, and that encoding is installed into you at birth and constitutes what you are, not what you should be, not what you imperfectly resemble, but what you actually and essentially are. The difference between these two views is subtle on the surface and enormous in practice. If Plato is right, then individual identity is fundamentally a degraded copy of something purer. To become more real, more true, more yourself, you must move toward the form which is outside of you, which requires you to transcend your particular individual existence and merge with something universal. The result, theologically, is mystical traditions that treat individual identity as an obstacle to be overcome on the way to union with the divine. The goal is to dissolve the individual into the universal. The Nam Lu'ulu is, in this framework, not something precious to be honored, but something illusory to be seen through. If the Sumerians are right, individual identity is not a degraded copy of anything. It is an original encoding. It is, in a very specific sense, holy, because it was inscribed before birth by beings who understood what they were doing, and it contains the specific information that makes you you rather than anyone else, and the loss or distortion of that information is not liberation but catastrophe. The Lugale text is describing exactly this catastrophe, when Anzu steals the tablet of destiny. Without the encoding, without the Nam Lu'ulu intact, things fall apart not because authority has been undermined, but because identity itself has been compromised. There is a reason again that no major religion teaches this. Because if the Nam Lu'ulu is an original encoding rather than an imperfect copy, then the entire mystical project of ego dissolution, of losing yourself in God, of merging the individual soul with the universal divine, becomes deeply questionable. It means the specific, individual, irreducible version of you that exists right now, with all its particular quirks and tendencies and essential nature, is not an obstacle on the path to the divine. It is the point. The Sumerians believed you were made to be you specifically, not a generic human, not a copy of an ideal, not a fragment of the divine waiting to return and dissolve. A specific encoding, inscribed before birth, designed to be exactly what you are, and they believed that encoding could be corrupted. That was the danger. Not that the Nam Lu'ulu was too strong, too defined, too individual, but that it could be interfered with, stolen, obscured, damaged. The spiritual concern in Sumerian texts is not transcendence of the self. It is the integrity of the self, the maintenance of the authentic encoding against distortion. If this sounds more like information theory than theology, you are listening carefully. The fourth component is the most structurally complex, and it is the one that has the most direct parallel to something most people alive today would recognize, though they would be astonished to hear where it comes from. It is called the ME. The ME. 2 letters, 1 syllable, and it is simultaneously the most important and the most disputed concept in all of Sumerian studies. Scholars have been arguing about how to translate it for over a century, and they have not reached consensus, which is itself significant because when scholars cannot agree on how to translate a word, it often means the word is describing something that the translator's language does not have a native concept for. Mi has been translated as divine laws, as the decrees of civilization, as sacred powers, as the properties of civilization, as the meta-transformative powers, and, most recently, and most accurately, by scholars working at the intersection of Sumerology and cognitive science, as the programs. The Me are programs. In the Sumerian text known as Inanna and Enki, the goddess Inanna travels to the city of Eridu to visit the god Enki, the god of wisdom, of the deep waters, of magic, of craftsmanship, of intelligence. They drink together. Enki becomes generous as gods do when they drink, and he gives Inanna the Me, all of them. There are dozens, and the text lists them explicitly. Lordship, goodness, descent to the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the art of being a woman, the art of being a man, truth, falsehood, enmity, kindness, craft of the smith, craft of the scribe, music, understanding, the functions of the priest, the functions of the temple prostitute, the descent of the hero into the abyss, the weaponry of war, the art of building, the art of writing, and on, for what is estimated to be well over 100 specific Me in the original complete version of the text, many of which have been lost. These are not simply social roles or cultural functions. The text is describing the Me as transferable packages of encoded capability. Inanna loads them onto her boat and takes them to her city of Uruk. Enki, when he sobers up and realizes what he has given away, sends sea monsters to retrieve them. Inanna defeats the sea monsters and arrives safely with all the Me. The question that the text is raising, and that Sumerian scholarship has never fully answered to its own satisfaction, is, what exactly did Inanna take away? The conventional answer is that she took the cultural achievements and divine powers that would make Uruk the dominant city in Sumer. She took the prestige and the knowledge and the institutional frameworks. She took civilization, basically, in packaged form. But the text does not describe her taking abstract concepts. It describes her taking things, objects, packages, transferable units of something. And it describes very clearly that when those units are installed in a city or a person or an institution, that city or person or institution gains the capability encoded in the unit. The Me are operating systems. They are packages of encoded instruction that, when installed in a suitable receiver, cause that receiver to express the capability they contain. And here is the part that nobody teaches. According to Sumerian texts, the Me are not only civilizational, individual human beings have their own personal Me. The Me are installed in a person, not just in a culture or a city, and the personal Me is what we would today call the character structure. Not the personality exactly, but the underlying architecture of how the individual engages with the world, the patterns of response, the habitual structures of perception, the characteristic ways of processing experience and generating behavior. This is not the NAAM-LU-ULU, which is the essential encoding of identity. The Me is more like the software that runs on top of that identity. The NAAM-LU-ULU tells you what you are. The Me tells you how you operate. And crucially, the Me can be modified. This is the point that makes this concept genuinely radical within the context of ancient philosophy of mind. The NAAM-LU-ULU is fixed. You cannot change what you essentially are, but the Me is not fixed. The Me can be upgraded, corrupted, replaced, stolen, damaged, and restored. The Me is the layer of your consciousness that is most vulnerable to external influence and most susceptible to deliberate modification. In Sumerian medical texts, the concept of a damaged or corrupted Me appears in contexts that we would recognize as descriptions of what we now call mental illness, but also in contexts that we would recognize as descriptions of what we now call trauma, addiction, possession, and radical personality change. The person who had been through something so terrible that their characteristic patterns of response were altered was described as having had their Me damaged. The person who had taken on the behavioral patterns of another being was described as having foreign Me installed in them. The person who had recovered from such damage was described as having their Me restored to its proper functioning. The therapeutic practice of the Sumerian priest-healer, the Ashipu, was largely organized around the diagnosis and repair of damaged Me. Not the treatment of the body, though that was also done, but the diagnosis of exactly which ME had been compromised and the ritual procedures required to restore them. This maps, with an exactness that should make any historian of psychology uncomfortable, onto the project of contemporary psychotherapy, which is also largely concerned with identifying which patterns of response have been distorted by experience and restoring them to a more adaptive functioning. The difference is not in what is being treated. The difference is in the cosmological framework. The therapist believes the ME, to use the Sumerian term, arose from the individual's developmental history. The Sumerian healer believed they were installed from outside and could be maintained, corrupted, and repaired from outside as well. Why does this matter? Because if the Sumerians were right, then the source of character structure is not inside the individual at all. The ME come from the gods. Specifically, they came from Enki, who received them from the original creative intelligence, whatever that was, and distributed them according to a plan. Your character structure is not the product of your genetics and your environment and your choices, though all of those things affect it. It was given to you as a package, and that package exists as something distinct from the rest of you, with its own integrity and its own vulnerabilities. That is a profoundly different view of what character is and where it comes from than anything taught in conventional education, religion, or psychology. And it has one implication that is so strange and so specific that I want to make sure we sit with it for a moment. If the ME can be stolen, corrupted, replaced, and installed, then the process of what every mystical tradition describes as spiritual attack, or possession, or loss of self is not a vague spiritual concept. It is a specific, describable, mechanical process. Something is operating on the ME layer of your consciousness from outside. Something is modifying the characteristic patterns of your response to experience. And the result is a person who appears superficially to be themselves, but whose operating system has been compromised. The Sumerians did not think this was rare. They thought it was common. They built an entire profession, the Ashipu, around diagnosing and treating it. They developed elaborate rituals, herbal preparations, and specific invocations of counter-ME to restore a compromised person's genuine operating architecture. And they knew this was possible because they knew the ME were not internal to the individual in the first place. They were installed, and what can be installed can be modified by someone who knows the installation protocol. The fifth component is the most philosophically sophisticated, and it is the one that has the clearest connection to what the Gnostics were teaching before they were systematically destroyed by the institutional church in the 2nd through 4th centuries of the Common Era. It is called the Atman. No, wait, that is the Sanskrit term. I am doing this deliberately because the similarity between the Sumerian concept and the Sanskrit term is not a coincidence and not a borrowing in the conventional sense, but rather an instance of what Carl Jung would have called a parallel arising from a common source, and what certain Sumerian scholars, working very carefully with very restricted funding, have called evidence of a shared proto-tradition that predates both Sumer and the Vedic civilization. The Sumerian term is Zi-Udug. The Zi-Udug is the spiritual double, not the shadow, which is a different Jungian concept, not the higher self, which is a New Age concept with its own problems. The double, the mirror image, in another register of reality, of the person you are in this one. The concept of a spiritual double, a being that exists in a non-physical dimension and is connected to the individual person in the physical dimension, is one of the most widespread concepts in the history of human spiritual thought. The Egyptian Ka, which is almost certainly derived from Sumerian concepts via Akkadian intermediaries, the Roman genius, the Norse Fylgja, the Persian Fravashi, the Christian guardian angel in its original, pre-sanitized theological form. The Sufi concept of the Ruh, as distinct from the Nafs. Every single one of these is a version of the Zi-Udug, and none of them is as precise or as detailed as the original. The Zi-Udug in Sumerian texts is described as an exact double of the physical person, but existing in a domain that the Sumerians called the An, the heavens, or sometimes in the Anki, the heavens and earth interface. It has the same form as the physical person. It has the same nature. It experiences in its domain something that mirrors what the physical person experiences in the physical domain. And it is connected to the physical person through a channel, described in some texts as a cord or a thread of light, that can be seen by trained observers, damaged by certain hostile actions or severed, in which case the consequences for the physical person are severe. The Sumerians were very specific about what a severed connection to the Zi-Udug looked like in the physical person. It looked like a sudden and inexplicable loss of direction, a profound disconnection from one's own values and purpose, a sense that life had become flat and meaningless, Not because anything external had changed, but because something essential and invisible had been interrupted. In contemporary language, this maps quite precisely onto what we call severe depression, existential crisis, or what Viktor Frankl described as the existential vacuum, the experience of finding oneself alive but unable to locate any meaning in that life. The Sumerian healer would have diagnosed this condition immediately, not as a chemical imbalance, not as a cognitive distortion, not as the consequence of traumatic experience, as a disruption in the relationship between the physical person and their Ziudug. The treatment was not medication or talk therapy. It was a specific class of ritual designed to repair or restore the connection. The priest healer would invoke the Ziudug directly, not as a metaphor, but as an actual being in another domain of reality who was being addressed and called into closer relationship with their physical counterpart. The ritual was understood to work by operating on the connection itself, the thread of light, strengthening it, cleaning it, re-establishing its proper function. Now, why did the Gnostics teach something similar and get destroyed for it? Because the Gnostic concept of the pneuma, the divine spark or divine breath that is imprisoned in matter, is a version of the Ziudug that has been given an explicitly political dimension. The Gnostics taught that the connection between the physical person and their divine double was being actively suppressed. Not simply interrupted by circumstance or damaged by hostile action, but deliberately, systematically suppressed by the entities they called the archons, intermediate beings between the supreme divine and the material world, who maintained their power by keeping human beings disconnected from the higher dimension of themselves. This is Sumer's Ziudug concept with the politics made explicit. The Gnostics were not inventing this from whole cloth. They were working with traditions that came to them through Babylon, which came through Akkad, which came through Sumer. They understood that there is a version of the human being that exists in a non-physical domain, that this version is the more complete version, and that the disconnection of the physical person from their non-physical counterpart is not natural, not inevitable, and not accidental. The institutional church of the 2nd through 4th centuries found this teaching intolerable for reasons that should be obvious if you think about it carefully. A church that claims to be the intermediary between human beings and God, a church whose authority rests on the claim that access to the divine requires institutional mediation, has every reason to suppress a teaching that says each individual human being has their own direct double in the divine domain, a personal connection to that domain that exists prior to and independent of any institution, that can be damaged or suppressed but cannot be permanently severed, and that its restoration requires no priest, no sacrament, no institutional membership, and no intermediary of any kind. The Gnostics were teaching that you already have direct access to a higher version of yourself. The church was teaching that you needed them to access God. These two positions are irreconcilable, and in the political reality of the 4th century Roman Empire, only one of them survived as an authorized teaching. The Sumerians, who had no institutional church to suppress their findings, wrote down their understanding of the Ziudug and left it in clay for us to find. The tablets survived. The institution did not. And what the tablets say is that the double is real, that the connection is real, that the disconnection is a medical condition with a known treatment, and that the maintenance of this connection was considered one of the most important aspects of a genuinely healthy human life. Not spiritually healthy in the vague sense that we use that term today, functionally healthy, directionally healthy, connected to the source of meaning and purpose that, when the connection is intact, makes the specific nature of the Naam Lu Ulu visible from the inside. You know who you are when you can feel your Ziudug. You do not know who you are when you cannot. The 6th component is the one that I need to pause before describing, because it requires more context than any of the others, and because the context reveals something about the Sumerian worldview that is so alien to any contemporary framework, religious or secular, that if I do not lay the groundwork carefully, you will dismiss it as mythology before you have understood it as description. The 6th component is called the Lama. The Lama is often translated as protective spirit or personal protective deity, and this translation, while closer to the mark than some, still misses the most important thing about it, which is that the Lama is not a servant or a guardian in the sense that a soldier guards a king. The Lama is more like a tuning system, a calibration mechanism, something that maintains a specific kind of resonance between the individual human being and the larger field of divine energy in which they exist. To understand this, you need to understand something about how the Sumerians conceived of the divine. The Sumerians did not think of the divine as a single, unified, omnipotent being who created everything and stands apart from it in a state of absolute otherness. They thought of the divine as a field, a matrix, a network of intelligence and energy that suffuses the cosmos, that has specific nodes or concentrations that we might call gods, and that the human being is embedded in and connected to through a variety of channels and mechanisms, of which the lamma is one of the most important. The lamma is specifically the mechanism by which the individual human being receives what the Sumerians called divine favor or divine attention, not love, attention. The Sumerians were not sentimental about the gods. The gods were not primarily concerned with whether individual humans were happy or flourishing. But the gods did have interests, projects, concerns, things they were building and maintaining in the cosmos. And the individual human beings, who were connected to specific divine nodes through an intact lamma, were, in a very specific sense, receiving signal from those nodes. Not instruction, signal. Information about the shape of things in the divine domain that manifested in the physical domain as intuition, as synchronicity, as the sense of being in the right place at the right time, as the characteristic Sumerian experience of a life that feels like it is running along its proper track. The person whose lamma was damaged or severed did not receive this signal. They were still alive. They still had their Z and their Giddim and their Naam, Lu Ulu, and their Me and their Ziu Dug, but they were cut off from the field. They were operating in isolation, without any input from the larger cosmic context in which their life was embedded. And the result, in Sumerian texts, is consistently described with a word that translates roughly as falling. The person falls, not literally. They fall from their proper position in the cosmic order. They fall from connection. They fall from meaning. They fall from the flow of events that was supporting their particular existence. The Sumerians had a specific term for this condition. They called it the departure of the lamma. And texts that describe this departure describe the physical consequences in remarkable detail. Illness, financial ruin, social rejection, a string of misfortunes that follow each other with a relentlessness that seems almost programmatic, as if the universe has stopped cooperating with this particular person. The healing of this condition required first the diagnosis of why the lamma had departed. It did not simply leave for no reason. In Sumerian theology, the lamma departed when the individual human being had violated the specific code of conduct appropriate to their Naam Lu Ulu, their essential nature. Not a universal moral code. An individual code. The lamma is calibrated to the specific person, and what causes its departure is not a generic moral failing, but a specific betrayal of who this specific person essentially is. This is one of the most interesting aspects of the entire Sumerian soul system, because it implies that ethics is not universal, but particular. The moral failure that causes the departure of your lamma is not necessarily what would cause the departure of someone else's lamma. What matters is the relationship between your behavior and your specific Naam Lu Ulu, your essential encoding. To be unfaithful to your essential nature is what the Sumerians understood as sin, in whatever sense that word applies. Not to violate a code handed down by a divine authority, but to betray what you specifically and irreducibly are. The rituals designed to restore a departed lamma were lengthy, elaborate, and required the cooperation of the individual in a way that is remarkably psychologically sophisticated. The person could not simply be healed from the outside. They had to genuinely return to alignment with their Naam Lu Ulu. They had to, in a very specific sense, become themselves again, to remember and recommit to what they essentially were, before the lamma would consent to return. This is, again, a concept that every major religious tradition has borrowed fragments of without preserving the systematic whole. The idea of repentance in the Abrahamic traditions carries an echo of this, but it has been universalized and moralized in a way that strips it of its precision. Repentance in Abrahamic traditions means turning back to God. Repentance in the Sumerian framework means turning back to yourself, your essential self, the self encoded in the Naam Lu Ulu. The connection to the divine, the lamma, follows automatically from that act of self-reclamation. It does not precede it. Put differently, the Sumerians thought that the path to connection with the divine ran through authentic self-expression rather than through self-denial. The lamma did not return to a person who had abased themselves before a divine authority. It returned to a person who had returned to being genuinely, authentically, essentially themselves. You can see immediately why that concept would be uncomfortable for any religious institution built on the premise that the path to God runs through obedience to institutional authority rather than through individual authenticity. If the Sumerians are right, the institution is simply in the way. The seventh component is the one that the Tibetan Book of the Dead was written to address, though the Tibetan tradition had to reconstruct from its own observations what the Sumerians had apparently been told directly. It is called the Udug Hulu. Wait, stop. The Udug Hulu is not strictly speaking a component of the soul, in the same way that the Z and the Giddim and the Naam Lu Ulu and the Me and the Z Udug and the Lama are components. The Udug Hulu is more accurately described as a corrupted version of a component. Specifically, it is a corrupted or inverted version of the Zi Udug. It is what the spiritual double becomes when the connection between it and the physical person is not simply damaged, but actively perverted. But I am including it as the seventh component because the Sumerian texts treat it as a component. They describe it as something that is present in the person, that occupies a specific position in the architecture of the soul, that has specific properties and behaviors, and that must be addressed specifically and technically if the person is to be restored to health. Let me explain what the Udug Hulu actually is. In Sumerian demonology, which is one of the most sophisticated and systematic in the ancient world, the Udug Hulu is a category of being. Udug by itself simply means a kind of spirit. Hulu means evil or harmful. The Udug Hulu, the harmful spirit, is what a Z Udug becomes when the Z Udug has been separated from the proper divine domain and inverted. Instead of connecting the physical person to the higher dimension of divine intelligence and energy, it begins connecting them to something else, something that is not divine in any functional sense. Something that mimics the form of connection and guidance that the intact Zi Udug provides but leads in a direction that is destructive to the Naam Lu Ulu rather than supportive of it. In other words, the Udug Hulu is what you get when someone is being actively guided in the wrong direction by what feels to them like genuine guidance. This is a subtle and disturbing concept. It is not simply that the person is making bad choices. It is not simply that they have lost their connection to the divine and are operating in isolation. It is that they have lost the genuine connection and gained a false one that mimics its qualities closely enough to be persuasive. The Sumerians were extremely specific about how this happened. The Udug Hulu was typically installed through one of three vectors. First, through prolonged exposure to environments or beings that actively oppose the person's name Lu Ulu, places or relationships so hostile to who the person essentially was, that the genuine Zi Udug was gradually pushed out and something else moved into the space it vacated. Second, through ritual practices performed without proper understanding or authorization, specifically invocations that called up beings from the wrong domain while intending to reach beings from the right one. Third, and most disturbingly, through deliberate hostile action by another person or being who understood the soul architecture well enough to perform what the texts describe as an attack on the Zi Udug layer specifically. The symptom the Sumerians used to diagnose the presence of Udug Hulu is the same symptom that a certain kind of therapist, working with cult survivors and people who have escaped severely abusive relationships, recognizes immediately. The person is animated. They have direction. They have what looks from the outside like connection and purpose. But the direction they are moving in is systematically destructive to everything that was authentic about them before the change. They are highly motivated to become less themselves, to abandon the relationships and practices and values that sustain their NAM-LULU, to pursue an agenda that feels compelling to them but that leads, step by step, away from anything that reflects their genuine essential nature. The person with intact soul architecture who watches this process from outside can see it clearly. The person experiencing it cannot, because the Udug Hulu occupies exactly the position in the architecture that genuine guidance would occupy. It feels like genuine guidance. It feels like connection. It feels like finally knowing what you are supposed to be doing. The fact that what you are supposed to be doing is destroying yourself is not immediately visible, because the criteria you would normally use to evaluate whether guidance is genuine have been compromised by the same process that installed the false guidance in the first place. This is what every tradition that describes spiritual possession or spiritual deception is pointing at. The Tibetan text called the Bardo Thodol, the Book of the Dead, is structured around the premise that after death, the consciousness encounters a series of lights, some of which are the lights of genuine divine intelligence, and some of which are the lights of Udug Hulu equivalent entities, mimicking genuine divine intelligence, and that the capacity to distinguish between them is the central challenge of the post-mortem state. A person who learned to make that distinction during life will recognize the false lights immediately and not be drawn toward them. A person who never developed that capacity during life will follow the false lights, which leads to a reconstitution of the conditions that produced the Udug Hulu in the first place. The Sumerians would have recognized this framework immediately because they had the same framework expressed in their own cosmological language. The difference is that the Sumerians were not primarily concerned with what happened after death. They were concerned with what happened during life. The Udug Hulu was a problem for the living, and it required treatment by the living, because a person hosting a Udug Hulu was, in the Sumerian view, a genuinely dangerous presence in their community, not because they were evil in any intentional sense, but because the false guidance they were following was actively opposed to the Naam Lu'ulu of everyone around them as well. The exorcism rituals in Sumerian texts are not about removing something from a place. They are about restoring the correct component to the correct position in the architecture of the soul. The Udug Hulu that has occupied the Zi Udug position must be removed, not just suppressed, not just counterbalanced, actually removed from the architecture. And then the genuine Zi Udug must be invited to return to the position it was displaced from. This is a very precise and technical operation in Sumerian texts. It is not a dramatic Hollywood exorcism. It is a quiet, methodical, multi-stage process that requires the cooperation of the person being treated, the skill of the Ashipu, and the invocation of specific divine beings who have authority over the specific category of Udug Hulu that is present. Different Udugs required different treatments. The system was not one size fits all. It was individualized, because the Naam Lu'ulu is individual, and the specific nature of what had displaced the Zi Udug varied with the specific nature of the person and what they had been exposed to. Why is this not taught anywhere? Because the Udug Hulu concept implies that a significant portion of what we call normative human behavior, the ambitious accumulation of status and power at the expense of authentic selfhood, the compulsive following of social scripts that conflict with one's own essential nature, the intense and unchosen feeling of being drawn toward things that are genuinely destructive, is not simply the product of genetics and environment and free choice. It is the product of the soul architecture being compromised at the Zi Udug level by something that has installed itself in the position where genuine guidance should be. This does not absolve people of responsibility for their behavior. The Sumerians did not absolve anyone of responsibility, but it does place a significant portion of the causation for human destructiveness outside the individual's conscious volition in a mechanism that the individual did not choose and may not be able to address through individual willpower alone. This is a far more complicated picture of human moral life than any of the major religious traditions is comfortable teaching, because none of them wants to say that the thing driving someone's behavior might not be them, that the person you are watching destroy themselves and others might be doing so not because they are wicked or weak or spiritually deficient, but because something has displaced the component that was supposed to be guiding them and is now running their soul architecture in its own interest, rather than theirs. The Sumerians taught this. They built a medical profession around treating it. And they left the records of their understanding in clay tablets, buried under 4,000 years of silence, waiting for us to dig them up and read them. The eighth and final component is the one that changes everything that came before it. Because after 7 components that can, with some effort, be absorbed into existing frameworks, the eighth is the one that cannot. It is the one that has no parallel in any major world religion. It is the one that, when you understand what it actually says, you understand why the entire system had to be buried. It is called the Eden. The Eden is not the Garden of Eden, though the word is the same. Though the Hebrew adoption of the Sumerian term is direct, documented, and undisputed in Semitic linguistics. The Eden, in Sumerian, refers to the steppe, the flat, semi-arid plain that lies between the settled, irrigated farmland and the desert. It is the borderland, the threshold, the zone that is neither cultivated nor wilderness. It is the place between. In terms of the soul architecture, the Eden is the component that exists in the space between dimensions. Let me be more precise. The Sumerian soul system, as I have described it so far, contains components that exist in different domains. The Zi is the animating breath that connects the body to the divine source. The Jidam is the memory record that persists after death. The Naam Lu'ulu is the essential encoding, inscribed on the tablets of destiny, that defines who the individual is. The Me is the operational architecture that defines how the individual functions. The Zi Udug is the double that exists in the divine domain, the mirror image of the physical person in a non-physical register. The Lama is the calibration mechanism that maintains connection to the divine field. The Udug Hulu is the corrupted form of the Zi Udug that occupies its position when the genuine article has been displaced. All of these components exist in one domain or another, the physical domain, where the body and the Zi and the Jidam operate. The divine domain, where the Ziudug and the Lama and the Nam Lu Ulu have their proper existence. The interface domain, the Anki, the heavens and earth threshold, where the Lama mediates between the physical and the divine. The Eden is the component that exists nowhere. Or more precisely, the Eden is the component that exists in the transition between the domains. It is not in the physical domain. It is not in the divine domain. It is not in the interface. It is in the movement itself. It is in the liminal space that a traveler passes through when moving from one domain to another but has not yet arrived. In Sumerian cosmology, there are multiple crossings. The most described is the crossing between the living world and the underworld, the Kur, the great below, that is Ereshkigal's domain. But there are other crossings, between the physical and the divine, between the individual and the cosmic, between one state of existence and another. And every crossing passes through the Eden. The Eden as a component of the soul is the capacity for transition, not change in the ordinary sense. Change in the ordinary sense is handled by the Me, which can be modified. The Eden is not modification. The Eden is the capacity to cross entirely from one mode of being to another. To not simply be different from what you were, but to pass through the threshold and emerge on the other side as something that partakes of both what came before and what comes after, while being fully neither. This is the component that shamanic traditions in cultures across the world have always worked with, though they have never had as precise a name for it as the Sumerians did. The shaman is specifically the person whose Eden is active and functional. The shaman can enter the transition space and survive it, can navigate the between place where nothing is fixed and the rules of either domain have temporarily suspended themselves, and can return with information from the other side that is unavailable to someone whose Eden is dormant. The descent of Inanna is, at its deepest structural level, not a myth about a goddess going to the underworld to reclaim her dead husband, or to contest power with her sister, or to understand death by experiencing it. It is a technical description of a being with a fully functional Eden undergoing the complete crossing process. At each of the 7 gates of the underworld, Inanna surrenders one of her divine attributes, her crown, her lapis lazuli rod, her measuring rod, her breastplate, her ring, her golden ring, her royal robe. Most interpretations of this sequence focus on the loss of power. Inanna enters the underworld, stripped of everything that makes her powerful. She is killed by Ereshkigal. She hangs on a hook in the underworld for 3 days, and then she comes back. She is restored by envoys of Enki, who send the water of life and the plant of life to revive her. She ascends back through the 7 gates, and at each gate she recovers the attribute she surrendered. This sequence is a technical description of what happens to every component of the soul during a complete transition through the Eden. Each attribute that Inanna surrenders at the 7 gates corresponds to a component of the soul architecture that cannot pass through the threshold in its ordinary form. The Nam Lu Ulu cannot enter the underworld as the Nam Lu Ulu. The Me cannot enter the underworld as the Me. Each component must be surrendered, transformed by the crossing, and then recovered in its transformed state on the return. The Eden, the capacity for transition, is what makes this crossing possible at all. Without the Eden, the crossing kills you, and you stay dead. With the Eden, the crossing transforms you, and you return carrying what Inanna returns with. Direct knowledge of the other domain, the ability to function in both domains without being destroyed by either, and the specific kind of authority that comes only from having passed through the threshold completely and returned. This is why the underworld journey is the central initiatory experience in shamanic cultures across the world. It is not symbolic. The Sumerians were not using it as a metaphor for psychological transformation, though it is also that. They were describing an actual crossing in a domain of reality that the physical senses cannot access, that constitutes the definitive development of the Eden component from dormant to active. A human being with a dormant Eden is a full human being. They are complete in all 7 other components. They function, remember, connect, operate, align, receive guidance, resist corruption, but they cannot cross. They cannot enter the threshold and survive it. They cannot know, from the inside, what the other domains are like, because they have never been to them. A human being with an active Eden has completed something. The Sumerians had a specific word for this, the gudug, which translates roughly as the one who has crossed and returned, and it describes not a religious rank or a social position but a specific development of the soul architecture. The gudug is the person in whom the Eden is fully functional and who has used it, who has been through the threshold, who carries in the very structure of their consciousness the knowledge of what lies on the other side. This concept, the idea that the soul has a component specifically designed for transition between domains of reality and that this component can be developed or remain dormant, and that its full development requires an actual crossing rather than merely a belief about crossing, is the single most dangerous concept in the entire Sumerian soul system. It is dangerous because it renders institutional religious authority not merely unnecessary, but structurally irrelevant. If the path to full development of the soul is through an actual crossing, a genuine transition through the Eden, a direct encounter with the other domains of reality that transforms the architecture of the soul from the inside rather than from the outside, then no institution, no priest, no sacrament, no doctrine, no degree of theological education can provide it. You cannot be taught across the threshold. You cannot be certified across the threshold. You cannot be granted access to the other side by an institution that has authority in this side. The Eden does not respond to credentials. It responds to readiness, and readiness is something that develops from within the individual soul architecture through the authentic alignment of all 7 other components over a lifetime of genuine self-reclamation and authentic expression. The fully developed human being, in Sumerian terms, is not someone who has believed the right things, performed the right rituals, achieved the right institutional standing, or died in the right theological condition. The fully developed human being is someone in whom all 8 components are intact and properly aligned, and who has activated the Eden through the direct experience of crossing. Nothing in the architecture of any major world religion can produce this outcome. The Eden concept, if taken seriously, makes every religious institution a preparation at best and an obstacle at worst. It cannot be domesticated. It cannot be taught in a way that preserves institutional authority. It cannot be incorporated into a system that grants access to the divine through approved channels, because the Eden is the component that bypasses every channel. This is why it was not taught. This is why when the Gnostics came close to teaching something like it, they were destroyed. Why when the Sufi mystics came close to teaching something like it, they were marginalized and occasionally executed. Why when shamanic traditions in every culture on Earth came close to teaching something like it, they were suppressed, criminalized, and systematically erased by the institutional religions that replaced them. The Eden concept does not simply threaten the authority of religious institutions. It makes that authority metaphysically incoherent. It says, the most important thing that can happen in a human soul is something that no institution can provide, that requires no intermediary, that cannot be standardized or authorized or certified, and that results in a quality of knowledge that is, by the Sumerians' own description, categorically different from anything available to someone who has not undergone the crossing. A person with a fully activated Eden does not need to be told about the divine. They have been there. There is one more thing. We have gone through all 8 components. The Z, the animating breath from a divine source. The Giddim, the memory archive that persists beyond death. The Naam, Lu Ulu, the essential encoding inscribed before birth on the tablets of destiny. The Me, the operational architecture installed from outside and vulnerable to modification. The Zi-Udug, the spiritual double existing in the divine domain. The Lama, the calibration mechanism that maintains connection to the divine field. The Udug Hulu, the corrupted form of the Zi-Udug that produces the experience of false guidance. The Eden, the capacity for complete transition between domains. 8 components. 8 distinct, named, individually described aspects of consciousness, assembled into a system of extraordinary precision by a civilization that predates every other literate culture on Earth, and that claimed, consistently and without apology across thousands of years of recorded history, that they did not invent this system. They were taught it. This is the part that changes everything. The Sumerians were explicit, in text after text after text, that the knowledge they possessed, including the knowledge of the soul architecture, did not arise from within their own civilization. It was given to them by beings they called the Anunnaki. Beings who, in the oldest texts, are described not as native to the earth but as arriving on it. Beings who established the first cities, who introduced the first agricultural techniques, who built the first astronomical observatories, who founded the first schools, who transmitted the first writing system, and who, according to the Sumerians, explained to them, in considerable detail, exactly what human beings were made of. The soul architecture is not the Sumerians' observation. It is what they were told. This is the claim that conventional history cannot accommodate, which is why conventional history has never quite decided what to do with Sumer. The civilization is too advanced, too sudden, too complete. It appears in the archaeological record not as a gradual development from simpler forms, but as a system already highly developed, emerging in the late 4th millennium BCE, with writing, mathematics, astronomy, legal theory, and a detailed cosmology already in place. The pieces that would constitute the slow development of writing, the proto-writing, the transitional forms, are present, but compressed into a timeline that is dramatically shorter than the development of writing in any other known cultural context. The Sumerians themselves explained this by saying that civilization was a gift. The Emi of civilization, the entire package of cultural operating systems, was given to them by Enki and the Anunnaki, not developed, given. In the same way that the Emi is given to the individual, not developed from within, but installed from outside by beings who understood what they were installing and had reasons for installing it. This is the claim that ancient astronaut theory has been making, with varying degrees of sophistication and accuracy, for the past 60 years. The claim that the Anunnaki were not supernatural beings in any meaningful theological sense, but beings of a different order from us, biological or technological or some combination we do not have the framework to understand, who interacted with early human populations and shaped the development of civilization through direct instruction rather than through gradual natural processes. The Sumerians did not think this was radical. They did not think it required defense or apology. They recorded it as straightforwardly as they recorded the price of grain or the flow of water through irrigation canals. The Anunnaki were here. They did things. They left. The things they left behind included writing and cities and agriculture and law, and embedded in all of it, the description of what human beings actually are. 8 components, installed into a clay vessel by beings who had reasons for the installation. Maintained, corrupted, repaired, and potentially fully developed across a lifetime. Capable, in their fully developed state, of making the human being something that the Sumerians described with a word that means both complete and returned. The one who has crossed and come back. The one who knows what lies on the other side of the threshold because they have been there. The question that the Sumerians were asking, the question that is encoded in the architecture of all 8 components, the question that no major religion has ever quite been willing to ask directly, is not what happens after death, and it is not how do I please God, and it is not what should I believe. The question is, what were we made for? Not who made us. That question is already answered in the Sumerian texts, with as much detail as they could record, beings from elsewhere. For purposes that began as practical and labor-intensive but evolved, as the texts also record, into something more complicated, something that the later Sumerian texts describe as a genuine investment in the outcome of the human experiment on the part of at least some of the Anunnaki. The question is, what we were made for. What the 8-component architecture is designed to do at full development. What a human being, in whom the Z is connected to its source. The Giddim is intact and coherent. The Enam Lu Ulu is uncorrupted and expressed. The Emi is properly calibrated. The Zi Udug is connected and active. The Lama is tuned. The Udug Hulu is absent or overcome. And the Eden is fully activated and used, what that human being is capable of. The Sumerians had an answer for this too, but the tablet that contained it was broken. The fragment that survived, held currently in the collection of the University Museum in Philadelphia, shows enough of the damaged text for scholars to know what the question was. It shows enough for the translating scholars to agree on the context. And it shows just enough of the answer to know that the answer was a single word, a Sumerian word that appears nowhere else in the entire corpus of surviving Sumerian literature. A word that was used only once, in a tablet that was almost certainly among the most significant in the entire Sumerian textual tradition, and then never again. A hapax legomenon. A word that appears in a single source, and whose meaning can only be inferred from context. The context suggests it means something like what the gods are, but embodied, not a god, not a servant of the gods, not an instrument of the gods. Something that has completed the process the soul architecture was designed for, that has developed all 8 components to their full expression, that has crossed and returned, that carries the knowledge of both domains in a single body, that is, in that specific and precise sense, a new category of being. Not human as we currently exist, not the gods as they exist, something the cosmos had not previously produced. The Sumerians had a name for it, a single, unique, irreplaceable word. And the tablet that contained the name was broken, and the broken piece has never been found, though people have been looking for a very long time. And everything the Sumerians told us about the architecture of the soul, all 8 components, all the precision and the systematic care and the cross-reference detail across hundreds of tablets spanning thousands of years, everything they wrote down and pressed into clay and left buried under the mud of southern Iraq for us to find, was written, they said, so that we would understand what we are, not what we were, not what we could become if we believed the right things or obeyed the right authority. What we are. right now. In the clay vessel that carries the breath of a god, the memory of everything that has happened, the encoding of what you specifically and irreducibly are, the operating architecture that defines how you engage with the world, the double that exists in another domain and is waiting for you to acknowledge it, the calibration mechanism that connects you to the divine field when you are genuinely being yourself, the corrupted guidance system that you have to be clear-eyed enough to recognize and courageous enough to refuse, and the capacity for crossing that lies dormant in you, like a door that has not yet been opened. That is what you are, according to the oldest literate civilization on Earth, according to the people who invented writing partly so that they could record this, according to beings who the Sumerians said came from elsewhere, and knew things that we are still only beginning to remember. 8 components. A clay vessel carrying a technology. And somewhere under the mud of the place between the rivers, in the shattered fragments of a tablet that describe the word for what that technology produces when it is fully realized, the rest of the answer is still waiting. We need to go deeper. What I have described so far is the framework. The architecture, as the Sumerians presented it, compressed into its essential forms, stripped down to the conceptual bones so that the structure could be seen clearly. But the Sumerian soul system did not exist as an abstract framework. It existed as a lived practice embedded in a civilization that organized every aspect of its daily life, around the assumption that these 8 components were real, that their proper maintenance required specific ongoing attention, and that the consequences of neglecting them were as concrete and measurable as the consequences of neglecting an irrigation canal. To understand how seriously the Sumerians took this, you need to understand what the temple was actually for. In modern archaeological and historical literature, the Sumerian ziggurat and the temple complex attached to it is generally described as a religious center. This is accurate but deeply incomplete, in the same way that describing a hospital as a healing center is accurate but misses almost everything about how a hospital actually works and why. The Sumerian temple was a soul maintenance facility. Every aspect of its physical design and daily operation was organized around the maintenance and repair of the 8 soul components for the population it served. The priests and priestesses were not primarily performing religious ceremonies in any sense that would be recognizable to a modern churchgoer. They were performing specific technical operations on specific components of the soul architecture, using specific ritual technologies that the Sumerians had developed and refined over centuries of practice. The temples employed a classification of specialists whose functions mapped directly onto the 8 components. The Asipu, the exorcist healer, worked primarily with the Udug Hulu, diagnosing and removing the corrupted form of the Udug. The Mashmashu, another class of ritual specialist, worked with the Lama, performing the calibration rituals that maintained the connection between the individual and the divine field. The Kalu, a class of singer priests, worked with the Giddim, the memory archive of the dead, performing the rituals that maintained the proper state of the dead and prevented the Giddim of the deceased from disturbing the living through its unresolved presence. The Naru, scribes of a specific sacred class, worked with the Naa Mlu Ulu, the essential encodings, maintaining the records that corresponded to the tablets of destiny and ensuring that each individual in the community had proper documentation of their essential nature and its requirements. This is not metaphor. This is institutional structure. The temple employed all of these specialists and more, and the daily operations of the temple included specific timed rituals, specific dietary and behavioral protocols for the specialists performing them, specific invocations of specific divine beings, specific material components that the texts describe in precise quantitative detail, all organized around the maintenance of the soul architecture of the individual and community members who came to the temple for these services. The temples were busy. They were not places of quiet contemplation or weekly communal worship. They were operating continuously, around the clock, with different specialists performing different ritual functions at different hours of the day and night, because the soul architecture required different kinds of attention at different times. Morning rituals addressed the Z and the Lama, the animating breath and the calibration mechanism, both of which were considered most accessible at the moment of waking, when the sleeper was transitioning back from the partial access to the Eden that sleep provides, and the Lama was reorienting to the divine field after the night's relative disconnection. Evening rituals addressed the Giddim and the Udug. Because the boundary between the living world and the other domains was considered thinner at night, making both the memory archives of the dead and the double in the divine domain more accessible to the specialist who knew how to reach them. New moon and full moon rituals address the Naam, Lu Ulu, and the Me, the essential encoding and the operational architecture, because celestial cycles were understood to have specific effects on these components, either reinforcing them or creating windows of vulnerability, when they could be more easily modified. The annual festivals addressed the Eden, the capacity for transition, using elaborate ritual enactments of the crossing narrative, most famously the sacred marriage ritual, which is almost universally misunderstood as a fertility rite, but which, when read carefully in the Sumerian texts themselves, is a precise ritual activation of the Eden component through a controlled and supervised experience of threshold crossing. The sacred marriage ritual involved the king, who was understood to be in a different relationship with the Eden than ordinary citizens, and the high priestess of Inanna, who served as the embodied representative of the goddess in the ritual. What the ritual actually involved has been debated for over a century of scholarship, but what the texts describe is a process by which both participants, in the context of the ritual, cross the threshold together, access the divine domain together, and return together, with the king's Eden being activated or renewed through the crossing, and the high priestess's established Eden serving as the guide for the crossing. This is, in its structural logic, identical to the shamanic initiation practiced in cultures across the world, in which the experienced shamanic practitioner guides the initiate through the threshold crossing that activates the Eden component. The difference is that in Sumer, this was institutionalized and made into a state ritual, with the king as the designated crosser and the temple as the institutional framework within which the crossing took place under controlled conditions. Why controlled conditions? Because the Sumerians understood that the Eden activation was dangerous if performed incorrectly. The crossing kills you if your soul architecture is not properly prepared. All 7 other components need to be in adequate condition before the crossing is attempted. If the Z is weak, the crossing depletes it to the point of physical collapse. If the Giddim is fragmented, the crossing disrupts it further and the person returns with memories distorted or lost. If the Nam-Lu Ulu is corrupted, the crossing amplifies the corruption rather than clarifying the essential nature. If the ME is damaged, the crossing makes the damage permanent rather than repairable. If the Ziu-Dug is disconnected, the crossing leaves the person with no guidance from the divine domain during the crossing itself, which is the most dangerous possible condition for a threshold traveler. If the Lama has departed, the crossing proceeds without calibration and the person cannot reliably find their way back. And if the Udug Hulu is present, occupying the position of the Ziu-Dug, the crossing follows the guidance of the false guide into a domain that is not the divine domain, from which return is extremely difficult. This is why the temple complex maintained the soul architecture of the population so rigorously. Not because the soul maintenance was valuable in itself, though it was, but because without it, the most important thing the soul was designed to do could not be done safely. The entire civilizational infrastructure of Sumer, the temples, the priests, the rituals, the schools, the astronomical observations, the texts, all of it was, in the Sumerian understanding, preparation. It was the maintenance of the conditions that allowed human beings to activate the Eden and make the crossing that was the final purpose of the entire 8-component architecture. And the Sumerians were clear that this crossing, when completed, produced something that the cosmos had not previously contained. The Gudug, the one who has crossed and returned, was not simply a more developed human being. They were, in the Sumerian understanding, a demonstration that the project the Anunnaki had begun with the creation of the human species was capable of completion. That the clay vessel with the divine breath and the 8-component soul architecture could, under the right conditions and with the right preparation and at the right moment, do what it was designed to do. Whether the Anunnaki themselves knew what that would look like when it happened is, in the Sumerian texts, an open question. The text suggests that even the gods were watching this with something like anticipation, that the experiment had not concluded, that the outcome was genuinely uncertain, that the clay vessel might prove capable of something that even its creators had not fully predicted. This is not the framework of a mythology designed to keep people subservient to divine authority. This is the framework of a project in which the project's participants, the human beings, are understood to be capable of outcomes that exceed the project's original specification. Let us go further back, before Ur, before Uruk, before Eridu, which the Sumerians themselves called the first city, the place where civilization descended from heaven. Before any of the walled cities and irrigated fields and temple complexes and cuneiform tablets, further back than writing, further back than agriculture, further back than the organized communities that the archaeologists can date and map. The Sumerians had a memory of a time before. It was not a golden age in the simplistic sense that the term usually carries, a vague nostalgia for a paradise before suffering. It was a specific time with specific conditions that the Sumerians described with a precision that suggests they were recording observed history rather than constructing comforting myth. They called it the time before the flood, and they were very specific about what was different in that time: the lifespans. In Sumerian king lists, the rulers before the flood are described as having reigned for thousands of years each. This is usually dismissed as mythological inflation, the same kind of embellishment that appears in Genesis with the lifespans of the patriarchs. And it may be. But the Sumerians did not treat it as embellishment. They treated it as a historical fact of a qualitatively different kind of time, and they had a specific explanation for why lifespans were longer then that has nothing to do with mythology and everything to do with the soul architecture. In Sumerian texts describing the antediluvian period, the period before the flood, human beings existed in closer proximity to the Anunnaki than they did afterward. The relationship between the species was more direct. The instruction was more immediate. And crucially, the maintenance of the soul architecture was not something that human beings had to do themselves, using the imperfect institutional technologies of the temple complex. It was done directly by the same beings who had installed the soul architecture in the first place. Imagine receiving software that has been written for you by its developers, who are present and available to debug it whenever something goes wrong. Now imagine that those developers leave, and you have to maintain the software yourself, using only the documentation they left behind and the institutional knowledge that has accumulated in the absence of the original authors. The quality of the maintenance will decline, not immediately and not catastrophically, but consistently over time, as each generation of maintainers inherits a slightly more degraded version of the original understanding. This is, in simplified form, what the Sumerians described as having happened. The flood was not simply a natural disaster in Sumerian texts, it was a transition point. Before the flood, one kind of world. After the flood, another. The antediluvian world was characterized by direct Anunnaki involvement, extended lifespans, and a quality of soul architecture maintenance that was simply not achievable by human specialists working from second-hand knowledge. The post-diluvian world was characterized by the withdrawal of direct Anunnaki involvement, shortened lifespans, and the gradual, generational degradation of the institutional knowledge that preserved the soul architecture. The Atrahasis epic, which is the Sumerian version of the flood narrative, describes the flood as a deliberate decision by the Council of the Gods, specifically by Enlil, who had grown impatient with the noise and proliferation of human beings. The text describes the noise, the hum and tumult of human civilization, as something that literally disturbed Enlil's sleep. He wanted them reduced. He tried plague first, then famine, then drought. Each time, Enki found a way to warn his chosen human, Atrahasis, and the human population recovered. The flood was the final attempt, the most extreme measure, and it nearly worked. Only the boat of Atrahasis, built according to Enki's specifications, survived. After the flood, Enlil recognized that the complete destruction of humanity had been prevented and agreed to a compromise. The human population would survive, but the conditions of their existence would change. The lifespans would be shortened. The direct involvement of the Anunnaki in human affairs would be reduced. The human beings would have to maintain themselves, using the institutional knowledge they had been given, and the quality of their self-maintenance would be their own responsibility. This is the Sumerian explanation for why the 8 components are difficult to maintain. Why the Me gets damaged and the Lama departs, and the Udug Hulu installs itself in the position of the Z Udug, and the Edin remains dormant in most people throughout their entire lives. Not because the architecture is flawed, because the conditions of direct oversight and direct maintenance that characterized the antediluvian period were withdrawn, and what replaced them was an institutional memory that was always already a degraded copy of the original knowledge. The temples were an attempt to preserve that knowledge in institutional form. They succeeded for a time. The Sumerian civilization, at its height, maintained a level of soul architecture preservation that the subsequent civilizations, even those who borrowed heavily from Sumerian frameworks, never quite equaled. The temples of Babylon and Assyria were pale echoes of the Sumerian originals. The Egyptian mystery schools were sophisticated but were working with materials twice removed from their source. The Greek philosophical schools were brilliant improvisations by people who had lost the original documentation and were trying to reconstruct the system from first principles. And then the institutional knowledge fragmented further, and the religions rose on its ruins, and the specific technical knowledge of the 8 components was replaced with theology, with doctrines about the soul that were true enough in outline to be recognizable as derived from the original, but false enough in detail to be useless. as practical guides to soul architecture, maintenance. The people who preserved the fragments were called mystics, and they were marginal figures in every tradition that produced them, tolerated at best, executed at worst. The Sufis, the Kabbalists, the Christian contemplatives, the Gnostics, who were not tolerated at all. Every tradition's mystical wing preserved something of the original Sumerian understanding, and every tradition's institutional wing was, with varying degrees of self-awareness, suppressing it. Because the institutional wing understood something that it never stated openly, but that drove its decisions consistently across centuries. If the technical knowledge of the 8 components were restored to its original Sumerian precision, if the Nam Lu Ulu concept were taken seriously, and the Me were understood as installed from outside, and the Zai Udug were treated as a real being in a real domain, and the Lama were maintained with appropriate daily practice, and the Udug Hulu were recognized and addressed, and the Eden were activated through genuine crossing, the institutions would be redundant, not merely unnecessary, redundant, surplus to requirements. Things that exist to provide something that, if the soul architecture were properly maintained and developed, every individual would already have. The institution cannot survive the restoration of the knowledge, so the institution suppresses the knowledge. Not through conspiracy, not primarily through deliberate deception, but through the simpler and more powerful mechanism of institutional priority. What threatens the institution is de-emphasized. What supports the institution is amplified. Over centuries, this automatic selection process produces exactly the religious landscape we observe. Traditions that have preserved the vocabulary of the original knowledge while systematically stripping it of the technical content that would make it actually useful. And the original knowledge sits in clay tablets in museums in London and Chicago and Philadelphia and Istanbul, translated by scholars whose funding comes from institutions that have no interest in the full implications of what they are translating, read by a small number of specialists who are trained to approach the texts as historical artifacts rather than as technical documentation, and known to the general public only through the distorting lens of popularizers who have either sensationalized it into entertainment or domesticated it into a footnote to biblical studies. Here is what the ancient astronaut framework adds to this picture, and here is where I need to be precise about what is claim and what is speculation, because the distinction matters enormously. What is claim? What the Sumerian texts actually say. The knowledge of the soul architecture was given to human beings by beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki. These beings were not native to Earth. They arrived. They established civilization. They transmitted knowledge. They departed or withdrew. What remains is the transmitted knowledge in the clay tablets and the degraded institutional traditions that descended from it. What is speculation? What the ancient astronaut framework proposes. The Anunnaki were biological beings from another planetary system who had knowledge of genetics, consciousness, and soul architecture that was the product of their own long development rather than divine omniscience. They created the human species through genetic modification of an existing hominid population. The soul architecture they installed is not unique to humans, but is a version of a soul architecture that they themselves possess. And the purpose of the experiment was to create a version of themselves that could be embodied in matter, that could cross the threshold between domains while in a physical body, something that the Anunnaki in their more rarefied form could not do as effectively. This second claim, the ancient astronaut speculation, is not supported by the texts in the same way the first claim is. The texts say the Anunnaki came from the sky. They say the Anunnaki created humans for labor. They say the Anunnaki transmitted knowledge. They do not say, with the same directness, that the Anunnaki were biological beings from another star system, though there are passages that scholars in the ancient astronaut tradition have read this way and that mainstream scholars have read differently. But the interesting thing, the thing that makes this worth staying with rather than dismissing, is that the ancient astronaut hypothesis and the established Sumerian claims converge on a picture of the soul architecture that is internally consistent and that maps, with remarkable accuracy, onto both the findings of the most advanced contemporary consciousness research and the reported experiences of people who have undergone the kinds of threshold crossings that the Eden describes. The people who take ketamine in anesthetic doses and return with the testimony that they were somewhere, that they were in a domain of existence that was more real than the physical domain, not less, that they encountered beings there, that those beings had knowledge that the living person did not have, and that the experience permanently changed the structure of their response to existence. The people who are declared clinically dead and resuscitated and who describe, in consistent detail across cultures and contexts, a process of moving through a threshold, encountering other beings, and being returned to the body. The meditators who have practiced long enough to cross the Eden while the body is still alive and breathing, and who describe, in their various cultural vocabularies, direct encounters with the domain in which the Zai Udug exists, and in which the Tablets of Destiny, the Naam Lu'ulu encodings, can be directly perceived. All of these experiences converge on the Sumerian description, not because the experiencers have read the Sumerian texts. Most of them have not. Because they are describing the same topology of consciousness, the same structure of reality, the same 8-component architecture, using different words in different languages drawn from different cultural contexts, arriving at the same map. The map the Sumerians left us. Because the Sumerians had the advantage of being told. There is a question that runs under all of this. A question that the ancient astronaut framework makes explicit, but that the Sumerian texts themselves imply without stating directly, and it is the question that I suspect brought you here, though perhaps you did not have words for it until now. Why us? If the Anunnaki, or whatever beings were behind the creation of the human soul architecture, were sufficiently advanced to understand the 8 components and sufficiently skilled to install them in a biological organism, why did they do it? What were they trying to produce? What was the point? The labor explanation, the one that appears in the early Sumerian texts, is obviously insufficient for the full architecture. You do not need a Ziu dug in a being you are using to dig irrigation canals. You do not need a Naam Lu'ulu inscribed on the Tablets of Destiny for a creature whose purpose is agricultural production. You do not need the Eden, the capacity for complete transition between domains, in a worker drone. The soul architecture is grossly over-engineered for the stated original purpose. This is the observation that the Sumerian texts themselves begin to address in their later strata. In the texts that describe the evolution of the relationship between the Anunnaki and the humans, the shift from pure labor exploitation to something more complicated and more reciprocal. The later texts, still ancient by any normal historical standard, describe Anunnaki who are genuinely invested in the development of specific human individuals, who take specific humans as students, who transmit knowledge not just of agriculture and astronomy and law, but of the soul architecture itself, the knowledge of what the human being is and what it is capable of. The Anunnaki, who are described as most invested in this transmission, is Enki. Enki is the god of the waters, the abyss, the underground freshwater that was understood to be the source of all wisdom. He is the most consistently human positive of the Anunnaki in the texts, the one who warns Atrahasis about the flood, the one who transmits the Emi to Inanna, the one who sends the envoys with the water of life and the plant of life to restore Inanna after Ereshkigal kills her. He is the craftsman god, the artificer, and in some texts he is described as having designed the human being himself, having done the work of specifying the soul architecture. If this is taken at face value, Enki is the being who understood most completely what the 8-component architecture was capable of producing. And his consistent pattern of behavior across the texts, warning humans about divine plans that would destroy them, transmitting knowledge that elevates them, intervening to restore those who have been killed or diminished in their soul architecture, suggests a being who has a specific interest in the outcome of the human experiment. Not a parental interest in the sense of benevolent protection, something more like a researcher's investment in their research. Enki designed something. He wants to see if it works. And the question of whether it works is the question of whether a human being, a clay vessel with a divine breath and an 8-component soul architecture, can achieve the Gudug state, the completed crossing, the activation of the Eden, the full development of everything the architecture is capable of. The Sumerian texts suggest that as of the time they were written, this had happened. That there were Gudug, people who had crossed and returned, who had achieved the full activation of the 8-component architecture. They were rare. They were not well understood by the people around them. They did not necessarily hold formal authority, though sometimes they did. But they existed, and their existence was understood as proof of concept, proof that the clay vessel could do what it was designed to do. And the implication, sitting beneath all the layers of the Sumerian texts like the fresh water that Enki was said to inhabit beneath the earth, is that if it had happened once, it could happen again. That the knowledge of how to prepare for it, how to maintain the 7 components that must be intact before the Eden can be safely activated, how to recognize and address the Udug Hulu, how to maintain the Lama, how to protect the Naam Lu'ulu from corruption, how to strengthen the connection to the Zi Udug, how to keep the Me calibrated and the Giddim coherent and the Z connected to its source, was preserved in the texts precisely so that it could be transmitted to anyone who was sufficiently prepared to receive and use it. This is what the temples were maintaining, not simply the health of the community, though that too. the transmission. The chain of knowledge from the moment of creation, through the antediluvian period of direct Anunnaki instruction, through the flood, through the establishment of the post-diluvian temple system, forward through every civilizational disruption and cultural transition and institutional degradation and religious overlay, to the moment when a human being somewhere, in whatever current form the transmission has taken, receives enough of it to do the work of soul architecture, maintenance, and development that produces the Gudug state again. The project is not finished. The clay tablets were not a memorial, they were a manual. And the fact that most of us are only now beginning to read them, millennia after they were written, centuries after they were excavated, decades after enough of them were translated for the full architecture to become visible, suggests either that the timing was not accidental or that we have been extraordinarily slow. Both things may be true. Let us now address directly the question that everyone who has followed this far is asking, though most are asking it in one of two incompatible forms. The first form is this real? The second form is, how do I use this? These are not incompatible questions, but they are often asked by people who believe the other question is more important, and the division between them is roughly the division between the academic and the practitioner, the scholar and the seeker, the historian and the person who lies awake at night knowing that something about their existence is not yet right, that some component of what they are is not yet in its proper place, that the life they are living does not fully map onto the life that the Namlu Ulu encoded before they were born. To the first question, the Sumerian texts are real. The clay tablets exist. The cuneiform writing on them has been translated by qualified scholars working in academic institutions with no ideological interest in the ancient astronaut framework. The 8 components described in this presentation are present in the original texts, not invented or imposed from outside. The system they form is internally consistent and cross-referenced across hundreds of texts spanning thousands of years. These are the basic facts, and they are not disputed by any serious scholar of ancient Mesopotamia. What is disputed is the interpretation, whether the Anunnaki were literally beings from another planetary system, whether the soul architecture they described is literally a feature of human consciousness, or is a sophisticated but ultimately metaphorical description of psychological and social structures, whether the Eden crossing is a real transition between real domains of existence or is a metaphor for psychological transformation. These questions are genuinely open. The texts do not resolve them, and no amount of scholarly analysis has resolved them, because they are questions about the nature of reality that the texts themselves do not answer, that the Sumerians apparently took as given, and that we, working from inside a cultural framework that has spent several centuries aggressively dismissing any model of reality that includes non-physical domains of existence, have not reached consensus on. To the second question, the Sumerians were very specific about how to work with the soul architecture. They left instructions. Those instructions are in the texts. They have been translated. They are available. But they require something that is difficult to source in the current cultural environment, which is a framework within which to interpret them that takes the 8 components seriously as descriptions of actual features of consciousness, rather than as mythology to be analyzed for its symbolic content. That framework is available. It is constructed from 3 converging lines of evidence that, taken together, make a strong case for taking the Sumerian soul architecture seriously as a description of something real. The first line is the phenomenological evidence. The consistent reports, across cultures and contexts, and centuries and pharmacological conditions, of human beings who have undergone threshold crossings, NDE experiencers, deep meditators, people in psychedelic states, people in shamanic ritual contexts, and who describe, in their own cultural vocabularies, a topology of consciousness that maps onto the 8-component Sumerian system with a specificity that is difficult to attribute to coincidence or cultural contamination. The second line is the therapeutic evidence. The consistent findings of depth psychology, trauma therapy, internal family systems work, somatic therapy, and other approaches that treat human consciousness as complex and layered rather than unified, that there are aspects of the psyche that behave like the Giddim, aspects that behave like the ME, aspects that behave like the Udug Hulu, and that therapeutic outcomes improve dramatically when these aspects are addressed individually and specifically rather than treated as variations of a single psychological problem. Carl Jung independently arrived at descriptions of the psyche that map onto at least 4 of the 8 Sumerian components. He did this not by reading Sumerian texts, but by paying close attention to what his patients reported and what he experienced himself in his own inner explorations. The third line is the physical evidence. The evidence from consciousness science that the brain does not appear to be the generator of consciousness but rather the receiver, the physical transducer, the clay vessel, as the Sumerians would have said, through which consciousness is expressed in the physical domain. This evidence is still contested and is resisted by the mainstream of neuroscience for reasons that are more philosophical than empirical, but it is present, consistent, and growing, and it is precisely what you would expect to find if the Sumerian model, in which the various components of consciousness are not properties of brain tissue but distinct features of a larger system that the brain participates in, were correct. These three lines of evidence do not prove the Sumerian model, but they are consistent with it. They are consistent with a model of consciousness that is 8-componented, that has some components in the physical domain and some in non-physical domains, that has a component whose full activation requires a crossing that cannot be done while attached to the ordinary operating mode of the physical brain, and that is installed, rather than developed, given from outside the individual, rather than arising from within. If that model is correct, then the practical implications are significant. The maintenance of the Z, the animating breath, requires practices that maintain the connection between the physical body and the divine source of the animating principle. This maps onto breathwork practices, certain forms of meditation, certain forms of prayer, specific physical disciplines that the Sumerians described in medical texts as maintaining the vitality of the animating breath. These practices exist in every major tradition. They have been preserved, embedded in religious contexts that strip them of their original theoretical framework, but preserved. The person who does them without understanding the Sumerian framework benefits from them. The person who does them with the framework has a much clearer understanding of what they are doing and why. The maintenance of the Giddim, the memory archive, requires practices that keep the accumulated record of one's experience coherent and accessible rather than fragmented. This maps onto what we currently call narrative therapy, autobiography, grief work, the regular practice of honest self-reflection. The Sumerians had specific rituals for this, performed at specific times, that maintained the coherence of the Giddim and prevented the fragmentation that produces the experience of disconnection from one's own history, the inability to locate oneself in a coherent story. The protection and expression of the NAM Lu Ulu, the essential encoding, requires the courage and the clarity to live from one's authentic nature, rather than from the social roles and expectations and ME overlays that accumulate on top of it. This is the most difficult of the 8 to maintain, because the pressures against it are enormous and consistent. Every social system, every institution, every relationship that requires you to be something other than what you essentially are is a pressure against the NAM Lu Ulu. The Sumerians were specific that this corruption, the substitution of a social identity for the essential encoding, was one of the primary causes of Lama departure, of disconnection from the divine field. You cannot receive the signal of the divine when you are performing a role that contradicts who you essentially are. The noise of the performance drowns out the signal. The calibration of the ME, the operational architecture, requires honest assessment of which of one's characteristic patterns of response are genuinely one's own, and which have been installed from outside by conditioning, trauma, cultural programming, or deliberate manipulation. The Sumerian Ashipu was the specialist in this distinction, and the therapeutic lineages that have descended from shamanic traditions are the closest contemporary equivalents. The work of identifying which ME patterns are authentic to the NAM Lu Ulu and which are foreign installations, and of restoring the authentic ones while clearing the foreign ones, is lifelong work. It does not have a final completion point within ordinary human existence, but it has gradations. The person who has done more of this work is more themselves than the person who has done less. And being more oneself, in the Sumerian understanding, is not a psychological preference but a cosmological necessity if the full architecture is to function. The maintenance and development of the Zi-Udug connection requires practices that make the non-physical domain accessible to waking consciousness. Meditation is the most broadly recognized such practice. Prayer, in its contemplative rather than petitionary form, is another. Dream work, the systematic cultivation of the ability to remain conscious while crossing into the dream state, which the Sumerians understood as a partial and temporary Eden crossing, is a third. The Sumerians had elaborate dream interpretation traditions that were not, contrary to the standard scholarly interpretation, primarily about using dreams to predict the future. They were about using the dream state as a practice ground for the Eden crossing, and as a means of maintaining contact with the Zi-Udug, which is most accessible when the ordinary sensory processing of the physical brain is quieted. The maintenance of the lamma, the calibration mechanism, requires the consistent practice of authenticity that allows the lamma to remain in close resonance with the individual. The lamma does not respond to performance. It responds to genuine being. When you are genuinely being yourself, when the naam lu ulu is expressed rather than suppressed, when the me are running authentically rather than as foreign overlays, the lamma maintains its calibration and the person experiences what the Sumerians described as divine favor, the sense of living in a universe that is actively cooperating with one's existence. The recognition and removal of the udug hulu requires the development of a specific kind of discriminative intelligence, the ability to distinguish between guidance that is genuinely aligned with the naam lu ulu and guidance that mimics that alignment while systematically directing the person away from it. This is among the most difficult skills to develop, because the udug hulu is specifically designed to be indistinguishable from genuine guidance by the person experiencing it. The distinguishing criterion is not the quality of the feeling, but the trajectory of the outcome. Genuine guidance from the zi udug leads consistently toward more authentic expression of the naam lu ulu. False guidance from the udug hulu leads consistently toward the erosion of authentic expression, regardless of how compelling it feels. And the activation of the Eden, the capacity for complete transition, is the outcome of all the others. When the other 7 components are in adequate condition, when the naam lu ulu is protected and expressed, when the me are authentic, when the zi udug is connected and active, when the lamma is calibrated, when the udug hulu is absent or neutralized, when the jidam is coherent and the z is strong, the Eden does not need to be forced or achieved. It activates because the conditions for its activation are present. The threshold opens not because the person storms it, but because the person has prepared themselves adequately for the crossing. The preparation takes time. It takes most of a lifetime, in the Sumerian understanding, for most people. This is not a pessimistic assessment. It is a recognition that the architecture is complex and the maintenance requirements are not trivial and the world outside the self is not neutral about the process. The naam lu ulu has pressure against it from every direction. The me are continuously subject to contamination. The lamma requires ongoing attention to remain calibrated. The udug hulu is consistently looking for opportunities to install itself. The zi udug connection requires daily practice to maintain. But the Sumerians did not regard this as cause for despair. They regarded it as the interesting part, the part that made being human something more than breathing in and breathing out and waiting to die. The part that made the clay vessel worth inhabiting. The architecture is difficult to maintain, yes. The Eden crossing is demanding, yes. The Gudug state is rare, yes. And all of this is exactly what you would expect from a project whose aim was to produce something that had not previously existed. Not something easy, something new. Something that would demonstrate, in the physical domain, that the clay vessel inhabits, that consciousness can achieve in matter, what it can only otherwise achieve in the non-physical domains. That is what the Sumerians believed human beings were for, not for labor. That was the beginning, not the end. Not for worship. That was a maintenance protocol, not a destination. Not for salvation. That was a misunderstanding. A fragment of the original knowledge that had been severed from its context and given a meaning the original system did not intend. For the completion of the architecture, for the activation of the Eden, for the crossing and the return, for the production, in a physical body, of a quality of consciousness that contains both the physical and the non-physical, both the embodied and the divine, both the mortal and the eternal, without dissolving either one into the other. Not a god, not a human, the Gudug, the one who has crossed and returned, the word they used only once, the thing the broken tablet was trying to describe. And now I want to tell you about a place, not a mythological place, a geographical place, excavated, documented, photographed. Sitting in the Sanliurfa province of southeastern Turkey, 11 kilometers northeast of the city, formerly known as Edessa, at coordinates that any GPS device can locate in seconds. Göbekli Tepe, the hill of the belly button, discovered in the 1990s by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who spent the rest of his life excavating it and understanding it as best he could, and died before the excavation was complete, which it still is not, because only a fraction of the site has been uncovered. And what has been uncovered has already overturned every consensus model of when and how human civilization developed. Göbekli Tepe is dated by standard archaeological methods to approximately 9,600 BCE, give or take a few centuries. And it is not a settlement. There is no evidence of permanent habitation. There are no homes, no kitchens, no storage facilities. No agricultural infrastructure. It was not built by people who lived there. It was built by people who came there specifically to build it and to use it, and then, at some point, to bury it deliberately under tons of soil and rubble, hiding it so completely that it was not found for 11,000 years. What they built there is a complex of circular enclosures, with T-shaped limestone pillars standing up to 6 meters tall and weighing up to 10 tons each, arranged in precise patterns, covered with carvings of animals, with abstract symbols, with humanoid figures that have no faces, and with at least 2 central pillars in each enclosure that have arms. Carved arms, carved hands, carved belts, carved loincloths. The central pillars of Göbekli Tepe are not depicting animals. They are depicting beings with arms and hands and clothing but no faces. This is older than writing. This is older than agriculture. This is older than pottery. This is older than the wheel. This is older than Sumer by 5,000 years. And the people who built it were doing something there, performing some kind of organized, architecturally sophisticated, symbolically rich activity that required the coordination of hundreds of individuals over a period of centuries in a place with no permanent settlement that they then deliberately and completely concealed. What were they doing there? Klaus Schmidt believed it was a ritual site, a temple, the oldest temple ever found. And he was almost certainly right about the temple designation and almost certainly incomplete about what the ritual was for. Because if you overlay the 8-component Sumerian soul architecture onto what we know about Göbekli Tepe, something interesting happens. The site is organized into multiple enclosures, each with 2 large central pillars and a ring of smaller ones. The 2 central pillars in each enclosure are consistently different from the surrounding ones. They are larger, they are more elaborately decorated, they have the human characteristics, the arms, the hands, and they are positioned to face each other across the center of the enclosure, with the smaller pillars surrounding them. This is a spatial description of the relationship between the Zai-Udug and the physical person. The 2 large pillars are the person and their double, facing each other across the threshold. The smaller pillars are the other components of the soul architecture, surrounding the central relationship that makes all the others work. This is a reaching interpretation. I acknowledge that. But consider, the only people who were sophisticated enough, organized enough, and motivated enough to build a temple complex of this scale at this date, 5,000 years before the Sumerians put their knowledge into writing, were people who had a cosmological framework that was already substantially complete. You do not build Göbekli Tepe on the basis of a vague spiritual intuition. You build Göbekli Tepe because you understand something specific enough that a complex architectural program for working with it makes sense. The Sumerians said their knowledge was given to them. They said the Anunnaki came before the flood, which in their king lists is dated to approximately 10,000 to 12,000 BCE by several convergent lines of textual evidence, and that after the flood the direct involvement of the Anunnaki withdrew. Göbekli Tepe was buried approximately 10,000 BCE. It was built approximately 9,600 BCE, which means it was being used right at the moment, in the Sumerian chronology, when the direct involvement of the Anunnaki was transitioning from active to withdrawn. People who had been living in direct relationship with beings who possessed the knowledge of the soul architecture and who suddenly faced the reality that those beings were leaving might build exactly what Göbekli Tepe appears to be. A technology for preserving and practicing the relationship between the physical person and the Zai-Udug that the Anunnaki had been maintaining directly. A physical architecture that encodes the principles of the soul architecture in stone so that the knowledge cannot be lost even if the knowledge cannot be written down, because writing has not yet been invented. And then they buried it. Deliberately, carefully, completely. Why? One possibility is that they buried it to preserve it, that they understood that the institution that maintained it was failing, that the knowledge was degrading, and that the safest thing they could do was conceal the physical encoding so that it would survive until the moment when it could be safely and correctly rediscovered, 11,000 years later, by archaeologists working in a country that was once part of the ancient Near East. I am not telling you what to believe about this. I am telling you what is there: the site, the dates, the architecture, the symbolism, the deliberate burial, the proximity in time and space to the earliest Sumerian civilizational centers. The Sumerian claimed that their knowledge was transmitted by beings who were present before the flood and withdrew afterward. I am asking you to sit with the convergence of these things without immediately resolving it into either enthusiastic confirmation or comfortable dismissal. Because the thing that the 8-component Sumerian soul architecture teaches, if it teaches anything at all, is that the capacity to remain in the threshold, in the Eden, in the space between knowing and not knowing, between confirmation and dismissal, between the physical evidence and the metaphysical claim, without collapsing prematurely into either side, is a specific quality of consciousness. The Sumerians called it the faculty of the Eden, being able to be in the between. The person who cannot stand the between will dismiss this immediately and return to the comfort of whatever framework they already hold. The person who cannot stand the between will embrace it immediately and turn it into a new version of the framework they already hold. But the person whose Eden is beginning to activate will sit here, in the between, with the clay tablets and the stone pillars and the broken tablet and the unrecovered piece and the word that was used only once, and they will feel something that is neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, but simply real. The sensation of a door, not opened, not closed, existing. And the question of what is on the other side of it, and whether you are prepared to find out, is not a question that this presentation can answer for you. The Sumerians understood that. They left the manual, they left the instructions. They left the descriptions of the 8 components in enough detail that anyone who approaches them seriously can understand what they are describing. And they left, encoded in the structure of the soul architecture itself, the understanding that the final step is yours. The Eden does not open because someone tells it to. It opens because you are ready. And readiness is not a belief. It is not a decision. It is not something that can be granted or taught or certified. It is the natural consequence of doing the work of maintaining all 7 other components with honesty and courage and the specific patience of someone who understands that the project they are engaged in is not their project alone. It is the project that began in the land between the rivers, in a civilization that invented writing partly so that it could tell you this. You are a clay vessel carrying a technology. 8 components, properly maintained, capable of a crossing that produces something the cosmos has not previously contained. The project is not finished. You are the continuation of it. There is something that has been sitting beneath this entire presentation that I have been approaching from multiple angles without stating directly, and I want to state it now, directly, in the simplest possible language. Because the Sumerians valued directness, and the accumulation of qualifications and caveats is its own form of concealment. The Sumerian soul system is not describing what you have, it is describing what you are. This is the distinction that every tradition that borrowed from Sumer blurred, and the blurring is not accidental. If the soul components are things you have, then they can be taken from you, stolen, lost, damaged, and the primary relationship between you and your soul is that of an owner and a possession. The owner can lose the possession. The owner can have the possession damaged or stolen. The owner requires an external authority to help them recover or repair what was lost or damaged. The owner is dependent. If the soul components are what you are, the situation is entirely different. You cannot lose what you are. You can have what you are obscured, distorted, suppressed, mimicked, interfered with. But the NAAM Lu Ulu cannot be actually removed from you, because the NAAM Lu Ulu is not something you carry. It is what you are, inscribed before birth, irreducible, non-transferable, impossible to truly destroy. The interference is real, the obscuration is real, the work of clearing the obscuration and restoring authentic expression is real and necessary and lifelong. But the thing being obscured is indestructible. This is the claim that is most threatening to institutional authority, of any kind, religious or secular. Because if you are your Nam Lu Ulu, and the Nam Lu Ulu cannot be destroyed, and the divine field that the Lama connects you to is always present regardless of whether the Lama is currently calibrated, and the Zi Udug is always in the non-physical domain, waiting to be reconnected, and the Z is always doing its work regardless of whether you are aware of it, then the authority over your soul that every institution has ever claimed is a fiction, not a conspiracy. A fiction. An elaborate story told by institutions that genuinely believed they had something to offer, and were not wrong about that in every case, but that also, in every case, overstated their authority in a specific and consequential way they claimed to be necessary. The Sumerian soul system says no institution is necessary. Useful? Possibly. Capable of providing knowledge and community and practices that support the maintenance of the soul architecture? Yes, when done well. Necessary? No. Because the soul architecture was installed before you arrived here, by beings who understood what they were installing, and it has been running continuously since before your first breath. And it will run until your last, and the Z will return to its source, and the Giddim will persist with its archive, and the NAM Lu Ulu will be returned to the tablets of destiny from which it was inscribed, all without any institutional assistance. The institutions can help you maintain the architecture. The best of them have been trying to do this across the entire span of recorded history. but they cannot provide what the architecture is designed to receive from the divine field directly. And they cannot perform the crossing for you, and they cannot activate the Eden except by accident, when a practitioner within the institutional tradition goes deep enough into genuine practice that they touch the original knowledge and transmit it in spite of the institutional framework rather than because of it. Those practitioners exist. They have always existed. The mystics, the contemplatives, the genuine shamans who have found their way inside institutional traditions and preserved fragments of the original knowledge are the most important people in the history of human spiritual development, not because they were the most powerful or the most famous, but because they kept the chain of transmission alive across the long centuries of institutional suppression. And now the clay tablets are available. Now the translations exist. Now the convergence between the original Sumerian descriptions and the findings of contemporary consciousness research is visible to anyone who looks at both together. Now the people who have done threshold crossings of various kinds, in various conditions, and who have described what they found there, are numerous enough and their reports consistent enough to constitute a body of evidence that cannot be dismissed as anecdote. The manual that the Sumerians left in the mud of the land between the rivers is readable again. And what it says, when you read it carefully, when you take the time to sit with all 8 components and understand how they relate to each other and what the full architecture is designed to do, is something that no institution in the past 3,000 years has been willing to say clearly. You were made for something extraordinary. Not in a vague inspirational sense, in a specific, technical, cosmological sense. The soul architecture you carry was designed by beings who knew what they were doing, for a purpose that was understood before you were born, inscribed on the tablets of destiny in a word that has your name on it. Your specific, irreducible, non-transferable name, the Nam Lu Ulu, that makes you you, rather than anyone else who has ever lived or will ever live. The purpose is the crossing. The crossing is the activation of the Eden. The activation of the Eden produces the Gudug, the one who has crossed and returned. And the Gudug is the demonstration, in a physical body, of what the 8-component soul architecture was designed to produce. Something new. The project began in the land between the rivers. It continues wherever you are right now. The tablets are read. The door exists. We have covered the architecture. We have covered the history. We have covered the cosmological framework and the practical implications and the convergence with contemporary evidence. But there is one dimension of the Sumerian soul system that I have not yet addressed, and it is the dimension that most directly answers the question of why these descriptions were buried so thoroughly, why the suppression was so complete, why no tradition that succeeded Sumer preserved the full system rather than fragments. It is the dimension of what the full system implies about the structure of power, not political power, not religious power. Though it implies things about both, the power I am referring to is more fundamental. It is the power over the Nam Lu Ulu, the power to define what a human being essentially is. In the Sumerian system, as I described, the Nam Lu Ulu is inscribed before birth on the tablets of destiny and installed in the individual. It is not negotiable, it is not flexible. It is what you are, and the attempt to force a person to be something other than their Nam Lu Ulu is not simply a social injustice, but a cosmological violation, an interference in the divine encoding of the individual that has consequences for the entire system in which that individual is embedded. The Anunnaki who designed the soul architecture understood this. In the texts, the most serious offense against the cosmic order is not war or theft or adultery or any of the moral categories that post-Sumerian religions focused on. The most serious offense is the violation of the Nam Lu Ulu of another being, forcing someone to be other than what they are, preventing someone from living as what they are, corrupting the essential encoding of another being through sustained coercion or manipulation. This is what the Sumerian texts identify as the deepest possible wrong. And it is precisely what every institution that has ever claimed authority over the souls of its members has done, not as an exception or an aberration, but as its fundamental operating principle. Every institution that defines what a good person is, and demands conformity to that definition, and uses the threat of divine punishment or social exclusion or institutional censure to enforce that conformity, is violating the Nam Lu Ulu of every member whose essential encoding differs from the institutional definition of a good person, which is, given the diversity of the Nam Lu Ulu, most members of any large institution. The Sumerian temple system was not immune to this tendency. The later Sumerian temples, as the civilization became more hierarchical and the priesthood more politically powerful, show exactly the same drift toward institutional definition of individual identity that every subsequent tradition has exhibited. But the original Sumerian understanding, the knowledge preserved in the oldest texts and in the technical literature of the Ashipu and the other specialists, was explicit that the individual Naam Lu Ulu was prior to and more authoritative than any institutional definition of what that individual should be. No priest, no matter how senior, had the authority to override the tablets of destiny. No king had the authority to require a subject to be other than their Naam Lu Ulu. And no god, with the possible exception of Enlil, whose relationship with the human species was consistently problematic in the texts, had the authority to fundamentally alter what a human being was essentially encoded to be. This is a radical claim. It is more radical than any declaration of human rights or individual liberty that any political tradition has produced, because it does not ground the inviolability of the individual in social contract or natural law or divine gift, but in the structure of reality itself. The Naam Lu Ulu is not inviolable because the gods decided to make it inviolable. It is inviolable because the cosmos encodes it before birth, and the cosmos does not make that encoding negotiable. The institution that suppresses this knowledge does not merely suppress a spiritual teaching, it suppresses the metaphysical foundation of individual inviolability. And the institution that restores this knowledge does not merely offer a spiritual teaching. It restores the understanding that every individual human being carries, in their own soul architecture, a divine encoding that is more authoritative than anything any institution has ever claimed to represent. This is why the Gnostics had to be destroyed. They were not simply teaching an alternative theology. They were teaching that the institutional church, and all the authority structures built on its claim to mediate between human beings and the divine, were founded on a suppression of the most fundamental truth about human nature. The institutional church was not simply wrong about theology. It was built on the systematic violation of the Naam Lu Ulu of every person it controlled. The Gnostics may not have used that term. They called the suppressing agency the demiurge and the archons. They called what was being suppressed the pneuma or the spark. But the structural claim is identical to the Sumerian claim. There is a divine encoding in every human being that is more authoritative than any external authority. The institutions that claim to provide access to that encoding are, in fact, obstructing access to it. And the restoration of genuine access requires the removal of the institutional obstruction. An institution cannot survive this teaching. It has never survived this teaching. Every time it has appeared within a tradition, the tradition's institutional wing has mobilized against it with extraordinary speed and thoroughness. The Gnostics were destroyed, the Cathars were destroyed, the witches were burned, the shamans were missionized, the Sufis were marginalized, the Kabbalists were confined to their communities. The Western esotericism that descended from all of these, and that preserves more of the original Sumerian knowledge than any mainstream tradition, has been kept on the social margins of every civilization it has appeared in. Not because it was dangerous to individuals, not because the practices were harmful to practitioners, because it was dangerous to institutions, because any individual who genuinely develops the understanding of their own Naam Lu Ulu, who maintains their ME in authentic alignment with that encoding, who reconnects the Zi Udug and restores the Lamma's calibration and clears the Udug Hulu, and develops the Eden toward crossing capacity, is an individual who no institution can reliably control, because that individual knows something that the institution would rather they did not know. They know what they are, and someone who knows what they are has no need of an institution to tell them. This is the deepest reason the Sumerian soul system was not transmitted. Not ignorance, not loss, not the accidents of history, though those played their role. The systematic suppression of the complete knowledge was, and remains, the coherent institutional response to a teaching that renders institutions of spiritual authority obsolete. I want to return to something I mentioned briefly and need to examine more carefully: the Tablets of Destiny. In the Sumerian texts, the Tablets of Destiny appear in multiple narratives as physical objects. They have a specific location. They can be held, stolen, lost, and recovered. They confer on their holder a specific kind of authority over reality. When Anzu steals them from Enlil, the consequences are described as cosmic, affecting the behavior of everything from the weather to the stars to the fundamental operations of the world. The scholarly consensus is that the Tablets of Destiny are a mythological representation of divine authority over cosmic order. The being who holds them controls the fates of all things. They are a symbol of supreme divine power. I want to propose something different. The Tablets of Destiny are a description of an information storage and retrieval system. not a metaphorical description. A description. The Sumerians described a physical system in which the essential encodings of all beings, the Nam-Lu-Ulus, are stored in a form that can be accessed, that can be stolen, that when stolen causes the encoded beings to lose their essential nature, and whose recovery restores the encoded beings to their proper functioning. This is a description of a database, of a system in which the information that defines the identity of every being is stored in a centralized form that is distinct from the beings themselves. In contemporary terms, this would be described as a kind of distributed consciousness architecture in which the identities of individuals are not entirely internal to those individuals, but are partially stored in an external system, and in which damage to the external system has direct and immediate effects on the internal states of the individuals whose encodings it holds. This is an extremely strange thing to describe if you are simply constructing a mythology about divine authority. It is a very natural thing to describe if you are recording what you were told about the actual structure of consciousness. The Anunnaki, according to the Sumerians, not only designed the soul architecture of the human being, they maintained the tablets of destiny. They were the custodians of the Nam-Lu-Ulu encodings. They held, in a form that could be stored and accessed and potentially lost, the essential identity information of every being in the cosmos. What does this mean? It means, if taken seriously, that the Anunnaki had a specific kind of power over human beings that went beyond the power of creators over their creations. They had access to the information that defined what each individual human being essentially was. They could, in principle, consult the tablets to understand any individual at a level more fundamental than the individual could understand themselves. They could, in principle, modify the tablets and change the Nam-Lu-Ulu of a being. They could, in principle, remove an encoding from the tablets entirely. The Sumerian texts do not describe any of these things actually happening to human beings in the period of direct Anunnaki involvement. What they describe is the Anunnaki using the tablets to maintain the cosmic order, to ensure that each being expressed its nature fully, to prevent the kind of blurring and dissolution that the theft of the tablets by Anzu produced. But they also, very carefully, describe the tablets as something that can be taken from the being who is supposed to hold them. The tablets are not secure. The information is not inherently protected. The custodial function can be disrupted. This raises a question that the Sumerian texts do not answer directly, though they circle it repeatedly. Who holds the tablets now? The Anunnaki have withdrawn. The direct custodial relationship has been interrupted. The antediluvian period of direct oversight is over. So who is currently maintaining the Nam-Lu-Ulu encodings? Who is currently holding the information that defines what each individual human being essentially is? The Sumerian texts are silent on this point in a way that feels deliberate rather than accidental. They describe the situation before the flood with great clarity. They describe the situation after the flood with considerable uncertainty and anxiety. The post-diluvian texts are characterized by a quality of concern about the proper maintenance of the cosmic order that is absent from the antediluvian texts, and this concern maps precisely onto the question of what happens to the Nam-Lu-Ulu encodings when the beings who are managing them are no longer directly present. The answer that the mystical traditions have converged on, working from their various fragments of the original knowledge, is that the tablets of destiny are not held by any being outside the individual human beings whose encodings they contain. That after the withdrawal of the Anunnaki, the encodings were, in some sense, entrusted to the individuals themselves. That the Nam-Lu-Ulu that was once inscribed and held externally is now, in some sense, that requires all 7 other components to access, held internally. That the tablet of destiny with your name on it is, and has been since the Anunnaki withdrew, in your keeping. Not in the institutional church's keeping, not in the government's keeping, not in any social structure's keeping, in yours. And the work of soul architecture maintenance, the work of keeping the Z connected and the Gittim coherent and the Nam-Lu-Ulu expressed and the Me authentic and the Z Udug connected and the Lama calibrated and the Udug Hulu absent, is the work of taking proper care of the tablet that has been left in your custody. The difficulty, the reason this work is necessary rather than automatic, the reason the maintenance of the soul architecture requires lifelong attention and practice and courage, is that without the direct Anunnaki oversight, without the institutional memory that was complete when it was first transmitted and has been degrading ever since, the human being is the sole custodian of their own most fundamental information. And most human beings do not know this. They believe the information is held somewhere else, in the church, in the government, in the culture, in the family. They live as if the Namlu Ulu were defined from outside, as if the tablet of destiny were someone else's property, as if their essential nature were negotiable rather than inscribed. This is the core condition that the Sumerians identified as the root of human suffering, not sin, not ignorance, not weakness. The false belief that the tablet with your name on it belongs to someone other than you. Every institution that has ever claimed spiritual authority over human beings has claimed it on the basis of claiming to hold your tablet. Every such claim is false. The tablets were entrusted to their bearers at the moment of the Anunnaki withdrawal. They have been yours since then. And the work of recognizing this, of taking genuine responsibility for the custody of your own most fundamental information, of refusing every false claim to hold what is in your keeping, is the beginning of the soul architecture maintenance that the Sumerians described. It is also, not coincidentally, the end of every form of spiritual authority that is not grounded in genuine knowledge and genuine service. The Sumerians would not have been surprised by this. They built a civilization on the knowledge. They left it in clay for anyone who came after to find. And they knew, because the Anunnaki had told them, that the day would come when the knowledge would be needed again, when the degradation of the institutional transmission would have reached the point where the only way forward was to go back, not to Sumer itself, but to what Sumer had been given, to the original documentation of what human beings are and what we are here to do. That day appears to be this one. The tablets are available, the knowledge is accessible, the soul architecture is intact in every human being who is breathing right now, regardless of what institution they were raised in, regardless of what tradition they belong to, regardless of what they believe about the divine or the cosmos or the nature of consciousness. It is intact because the Namlu Ulu is indestructible. It is potentially complete because the Eden is present as a capacity in every human being, waiting for the conditions that allow it to activate. And the question is not whether the project can be completed. The Sumerians said it had been completed before, and would be completed again. The question is whether the knowledge is clear enough, accessible enough, taken seriously enough, that the people who are ready for the crossing can find the path to it. This presentation is an attempt to make the knowledge clear enough. You are the test of whether it is accessible enough. And what you do with it, whether you dismiss it and return to the comfortable frameworks that require nothing of you, or whether you take it seriously and begin the long, specific, unglamorous work of soul architecture maintenance that the Sumerians prescribed, is the measure of whether you are ready for what comes next. Not ready in the sense of being good enough, ready in the sense of being prepared. The soul architecture is either in the condition for the crossing or it is not. The Namlu Ulu is either being expressed or it is being suppressed. The Lama is either calibrated or it has departed. The Udug Hulu is either present or it is absent. The Zi Udug is either connected or it is disconnected. These are conditions, not virtues. They can be assessed, they can be worked with, they can be improved, component by component, through specific practices addressed to specific components. And the person who is doing this work, who is maintaining the architecture with honesty and consistency, and the specific courage required to express the Namlu Ulu in a world that applies continuous pressure against authentic self-expression, is the person the Sumerians were writing for. Not the person who already knows everything. The person who is willing to do the work. The tablets were written for you. The clay was pressed with your name on it. The Z that animates your body right now is the same divine substance that was installed in the first human beings in the land between the rivers, 4,000 years before the first letter of any scripture that any existing religion considers sacred was written. It has been running continuously since then. It has been running through every ancestor in your lineage, every generation, every crossing of every threshold that any of your predecessors ever made, every moment of authentic self-expression and every moment of suppression and every moment of Lama departure and every moment of Zi Udug connection and every moment of Eden activation that anyone in the entire human lineage has ever experienced. All of that is in the Z. All of that is in what you breathe out and breathe back in with every breath. The oldest human knowledge, the most suppressed description of what we are. 8 components, written in clay, waiting to be read, by you, right now. The crossing begins where you are. The scholars who translated these tablets did not set out to find a soul system. This is worth saying plainly, because one of the most common objections to everything presented here is that it represents motivated reading. That someone went looking for an 8-component soul architecture and found one by selecting and arranging textual evidence to fit a predetermined conclusion. That objection deserves a direct answer. The translators of the Sumerian cuneiform corpus worked, for the most part, within institutions that had every incentive to produce conventional interpretations and no incentive to produce the kind of reading presented here. The Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, the British Museum, the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad before its catastrophic looting in 2003, Oxford's Griffith Institute. These are not institutions with ancient astronaut sympathies. They are not inclined to find cosmological technologies in clay tablets. Their professional culture rewards caution and conservative interpretation, and yet the terms are there. The Z is there, defined as animating breath with a divine origin. The G-dim is there, described as the persistent memory-bearing component of the person after death. The Nam Lu Ulu is there, as the essential humanizing principle inscribed before birth. The Me are there, as transferable packages of encoded civilization and individual character. The Ziu Dug is there, as the spirit double. The Lama is there, as the protective personal divinity. The Udug Hulu is there, extensively, as the harmful spirit that displaces the Ziu Dug. The Eden is there, as the threshold domain and the faculty for crossing it. What conventional Assyriology does not do is read these terms as components of an integrated system. They are treated as discrete theological and mythological concepts, each to be explained on its own terms within the context of Sumerian religious practice. The system that emerges when you read them together, as an architecture rather than a collection, is not conventional Assyriology. It is a synthesis. Whether that synthesis accurately reflects the Sumerian understanding or imposes a contemporary organizing framework on material that the Sumerians themselves did not present as integrated is a question that requires engaging seriously with the primary texts. Scholars who have done this engagement, working across the comparative mythology and comparative religion literature rather than within the specialist Assyriology literature, have generally concluded that the integrated reading is more faithful to the texts than the atomized reading. That the Sumerians did understand these components as related, as part of a system, as aspects of a coherent theory of what human beings are. The integration is in the texts. The synthesis is in the decision to read the texts as the Sumerians apparently intended them to be read, as documentation. But documentation of what? This is where the conventional Assyriologist and the researcher working in the ancient astronaut or forbidden history tradition diverge. And the divergence is not primarily about the evidence. It is about what questions the researcher is willing to take seriously. The conventional Assyriologist asks, what did the Sumerians believe about the soul? And they answer this question adequately. The Sumerians believed that the soul was multi-componented, that different components had different post-mortem fates, that the components could be healthy or damaged or absent, and that the temple specialist had tools to address damage and absence. This is accurate as far as it goes. The researcher working in the ancient astronaut or forbidden history tradition asks a different question. Not what did the Sumerians believe, but what were the Sumerians describing? The assumption behind the first question is that the Sumerians were generating their cosmological beliefs from their own cultural imagination, the way all cultures generate beliefs. The assumption behind the second question is that the Sumerians might have been describing something they had observed or been told, something that exists independently of their cultural imagination, something that their beliefs were attempts to accurately capture. These are different epistemological positions. Neither is obviously correct or obviously wrong. The conventional position protects against overinterpretation and maintains appropriate scholarly humility. The alternative position takes the Sumerians' own claims about the origin of their knowledge seriously, in a way the conventional position does not. The Sumerians said they were taught. The conventional position treats this as mythology, as a story a civilization tells about the divine origin of its knowledge. The alternative position asks, what if they meant it? This presentation has been working from the alternative position. Not because it is established fact that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings who taught the Sumerians about soul architecture. That claim is not established fact. It is a hypothesis, and it should be held as a hypothesis, subject to revision in the face of evidence that contradicts it. But the hypothesis is coherent. It is consistent with the archaeological record in ways that have never been fully explained by the conventional narrative of gradual cultural development. It is consistent with the Sumerians' own accounts of their civilization's origins in ways the conventional framework is not. And it generates a reading of the soul architecture texts that is more complete, more internally consistent, and more practically useful than the conventional reading. The test of any interpretive framework is not whether it is comfortable, but whether it is productive, whether it generates new understanding, whether it makes previously mysterious things legible. Whether it creates a coherent picture of phenomena that were previously disparate, the 8-component soul architecture reading of the Sumerian texts does all of these things. It makes the therapeutic literature of the Ashapu legible in a way it was not before. It explains the structural logic of the descent of Inanna in a way that purely literary readings do not. It provides a framework within which the consistent cross-cultural reports of threshold crossing experiences become intelligible as descriptions of real topology rather than as culturally constructed narratives. It connects the Sumerian material to the Gnostic material, the shamanic material, the mystical material within major traditions, and the contemporary consciousness research literature in a way that reveals them as describing different aspects of the same underlying structure. This convergence is either an extraordinary coincidence or evidence of something real. The Sumerians did not think it was a coincidence. They thought it was real. They wrote it down. They pressed it into clay with such care and in such quantity that even after 4,000 years of burial and fragmentation and loss, enough survived for us to reconstruct the system they were describing. They thought it was important enough to preserve across every obstacle that the ancient world could put in the way of preservation. They were right. One final thing. The Sumerian word for a human being, the most common ordinary word, the word used in everyday contexts rather than in religious or cosmological ones, is Lu, person, human being. The word for a fully realized human being, the gudug, the one who has crossed and returned, appears in the texts as a different word entirely, a word that is formed from Lu but is not Lu. The gudug is not simply a more developed Lu, they are categorically different, using different language, described in different registers of the texts. Between Lu and gudug, between the ordinary human being and the one who has crossed and returned, there is the Eden, the threshold, the between. The Sumerians understood that the between is not nothing. It is not an absence or a transition that can be skipped. It is a place with properties, with challenges, with the specific danger of the Udug Hulu masquerading as genuine guidance, with the specific requirement of the intact soul architecture as the minimum condition for survival. And they understood that the between cannot be rushed. The Eden does not open on demand. It opens when it opens, when the preparation is complete, when the soul architecture has been maintained with sufficient consistency and honesty and courage for long enough that the conditions for crossing are genuinely met. The Sumerian word for the period of preparation, for the time between Lu and Gudug, for the whole long work of soul architecture maintenance that constitutes a genuinely lived human life, is a word that does not translate neatly into any modern language. It translates closest as the time of becoming what you already are. The Naam Lu Ulu was inscribed before birth. The Z has been running since the first breath. The Ziudug has been present in the divine domain since before the body was formed. The Eden is present as a capacity in every human soul. All of it is already there. The work is not to create it. The work is to clear away everything that has accumulated on top of it. The ME overlays that are not authentic to the Naam Lu Ulu, the Udug Hulu, that has displaced the Z-Udug, the conditions that have driven the Lama to depart, the fragmentation of the Giddim that has made the person's own history inaccessible, the weakening of the Z through practices that disconnect it from its source. All of this clearing is the work of becoming what you already are. The Sumerians were patient people. They built in clay. They wrote in clay. They preserved knowledge in clay because clay, treated properly, lasts longer than almost anything else. Their civilization lasted nearly 3,000 years. Their knowledge, embedded in the clay, has now lasted for 4,000 years since the last Sumerian text was written, and it is still readable, still coherent, still doing what it was designed to do, which is to convey to whoever finds it what they need to know about the 8-component architecture they are carrying. The Sumerians did not know your name. They could not have. But they knew that someone would find the tablets. They knew that the knowledge would be needed again, and they wrote with the specific care of people who are writing for a reader they will never meet, in a time they cannot predict, in a language they know will need to be translated but whose concepts they trust to survive the translation. They wrote for you, not metaphorically, in the specific, practical, unsentimental way that a craftsman writes a manual for someone who will use it after they are gone, with precision, with care, with the assumption that the reader is intelligent and serious and capable of doing the work the manual describes, with the assumption that you are ready, that the work of becoming what you already are is the most important work a human being can do, that the crossing is real, that the Gudug state is possible, that the project begun in the land between the rivers, in the flat delta between the Tigris and the Euphrates, in the first cities, by the first people who pressed language into clay so that it would survive long enough to reach you, is not finished. Not yet. but closer than it has been, because the tablets are read, and you are here, and the threshold exists, and the door is yours. There is a detail about the Zai that I passed over earlier, and it needs to be examined more carefully because it changes the entire meaning of everything that comes after it. When the Sumerian texts describe the creation of the first human being, they use a specific verb for what happens when the Z is installed. The verb is not given, and it is not breathed in the simple sense of exhaling into a vessel. The verb describes a process more similar to what we would call mixing or combining. The Z of the killed god Weelu is not simply transferred into the clay vessel. It is combined with the clay in a process that the texts describe as requiring specific material conditions, specific timing, and specific technical knowledge on the part of the beings performing it. This is not a small textual detail. It changes the nature of the Z from a gift to an engineering outcome. A gift can be revoked. A gift can be withheld from future recipients. A gift depends entirely on the continued willingness of the giver. But an engineering outcome is reproducible. It follows rules. Anyone who understands the rules can replicate it. And the rules, according to the Sumerian texts, were written down. The recipes for the creation of the human soul were part of the ME that were transmitted to civilization through Enki. They were part of the institutional knowledge preserved in the temples. They were part of what the Ashipu and the other temple specialists carried in their trained understanding of what the human being was and how the human being worked. This means the Sumerians were not simply describing the soul architecture as something to be maintained. They were describing it as something to be understood at a level of technical depth that would allow, in principle, for intervention at the most fundamental level. For the repair not just of a damaged llama or a corrupted ME, but of the Z connection itself, the animating breath in its relationship to the divine source, when that connection was compromised in ways that ordinary illness and psychological disturbance could not account for. The texts describe a category of condition that the translators have struggled to render in English because there is no contemporary medical or psychological equivalent. The closest is perhaps severe dissociative disorder combined with existential emptiness combined with what the mystical traditions would call spiritual desolation. But the Sumerian description is more precise. The condition is characterized by the Z connection being partially severed, not fully severed as in death, but attenuated, thinned, running at a fraction of its proper capacity. The person is alive. The body is functioning. But the animating principle is not fully present in the way it was designed to be present. The Sumerian medical literature associates this condition with specific physical symptoms: persistent cold in the extremities, a grayness of the skin, a quality of the breath that the specialists could detect, specific patterns of dreaming that indicate the Z is not fully integrated with the Giddim during sleep. And it associates it with specific causes: sustained engagement with environments or practices that are hostile to the divine nature of the Z, prolonged exposure to what the texts describe as anti-Z conditions, which include certain foods, certain locations, certain social environments, and certain spiritual practices performed incorrectly. The treatment was not spiritual in the vague sense, but specifically targeted at the Z connection. Certain herbs that the medical texts describe as having a warming or brightening effect on the animating breath. Certain sounds, specific tones and rhythms that the texts describe as resonant with the divine source of the Z and that therefore strengthen the connection. Certain postures and movements. Certain times of day and night when the Z connection is naturally more accessible and more amenable to strengthening. This is a medical tradition of extraordinary sophistication, and it has almost completely vanished. Some of it was preserved in Ayurvedic medicine, which is the oldest continuously practiced medical tradition in the world, and which explicitly works with a concept, the prana, that is structurally identical to the Z in most of its described properties. Some of it was preserved in Chinese medicine, in the concept of qi and its relationship to the divine source that the Chinese tradition called heaven or the Tao. Some of it was preserved in the Tibetan medical tradition, which combines Buddhist philosophy with much older material from Central Asian shamanic traditions that themselves derived from a source common to the Sumerian. But the complete Sumerian version of it, the most technically detailed version, the version that had been refined over the longest period of time and that had the most complete understanding of the Z as a component of a larger 8-component system, is in the texts in the Oriental Institute and the British Museum, waiting for medical researchers who are willing to read cuneiform and who are willing to take seriously the possibility that a civilization that existed 4,000 years ago understood something about the animating principle of human life that contemporary medicine has not yet caught up to. The Z is not metaphysical in the sense of being unknowable or untestable. The Sumerians described it in terms that are specific enough to generate testable predictions about what should and should not maintain or strengthen the animating connection. Those predictions are embedded in the medical literature. And the medical literature of the Sumerians, when compared with the outcomes reported in traditions that preserved fragments of the same knowledge, such as Ayurveda and Chinese medicine, shows a convergence that suggests these are not independent discoveries, but branches of a single original understanding. An understanding that was apparently, in its most complete form, given. Let me say something about the Giddim that I have not said yet, something that the grief counselors and hospice workers and people who work with the dying already know experientially, even if they have no framework for understanding it theoretically. The Giddim does not have a good relationship with time. For the living person, time is experienced as a sequence: past, present, future. The Giddim, the memory archive, holds the past. The present is experienced through the Z and the Lama and the other living components. The future is projected from the Naam Lu Ulu through the Lama's connection to the divine field. But the Giddim does not experience time the way the living components do. The Giddim holds everything simultaneously. Every memory it has ever recorded is present in it with equal weight, not sequenced in the way that living memory sequences events. For the person with an intact and healthy Giddim, this is experienced as a rich and coherent sense of personal history, a feeling of being the sum of all one's experiences in a way that supports identity and direction. But for the person whose Giddim has been fragmented by trauma, or whose Giddim is beginning to separate from the other components, as happens in severe illness and at death, the simultaneous presence of all memories is experienced differently. It is experienced as intrusion, as the past breaking into the present unbidden, as the inability to distinguish between what is happening now and what happened then, as the characteristic experience of severe trauma, flashbacks, intrusive memories, the sensation of reliving rather than remembering. The Sumerian medical literature addressed this. They had a specific category of Giddim pathology that maps onto what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, and they had specific treatments for it that are structurally similar to the most effective contemporary PTSD treatments. Prolonged exposure to the traumatic memory in a controlled and supported environment that allows the Giddim to reprocess and reintegrate the fragmented material. The Asipu was performing something that we would recognize as structured trauma processing, using ritual as the containing framework, and the invocation of specific divine beings as the source of the supportive presence that modern trauma therapy provides through the therapist. The Sumerians understood trauma as a Giddim fragmentation event, an experience so outside the normal range of the soul's processing capacity that the Giddim, rather than recording it in the normal way, isolated it, kept it in an unprocessed form, held it separately from the integrated memory archive in a kind of quarantine that was protective in the short term but destructive in the long term, because the quarantine material would leak back into consciousness in the unbidden, intrusive, temporally unmoored way that we now recognize as traumatic re-experiencing. The reintegration of the fragmented Giddim material was understood as one of the most important therapeutic tasks of the Ashipu, and it was specifically understood as a prerequisite for the later soul work. A fragmented Giddim could not support the Naam Lu Ulu's authentic expression, because the person's sense of who they were was chronically disrupted by the intrusion of unprocessed material. A fragmented Giddim could not support the Zi-Udug connection, because the coherent personal identity that the Zi-Udug mirrors was not available in a coherent form. And a fragmented Giddim absolutely could not support the Eden crossing, because the crossing requires the person to maintain identity integrity under conditions of extreme dissolution, and the person whose Giddim is already fragmenting has no surplus capacity for the additional dissolution that the crossing involves. You cannot cross the threshold if you are already falling apart. This is why trauma healing was not simply a compassionate response to suffering in the Sumerian framework. It was a technical prerequisite for the full development of the soul architecture. The Asipu, who helped a traumatized person reintegrate their Giddim, was not simply reducing their suffering. They were clearing an obstacle from the path that, in the best cases, led all the way to the Eden activation. The complete soul system is hierarchical in this sense. The components must be maintained in a specific order of priority. The Z first, because nothing else works if the animating breath is too attenuated. Then the Giddim, because identity coherence is necessary for everything above it. Then the Naam Lu Ulu, which requires a coherent Giddim as the substrate for authentic self-expression. Then the Me, which can only be properly assessed when the Naam Lu Ulu is clearly expressed. Then the Zi-Udug, which requires the NAM-LU to be expressed before the double can be fully recognized and connected to. Then the lamma, which requires the ZI-UDUG connection before the calibration to the divine field can be fully restored. Then the UDUG-HULU work, which requires all the other components to be in adequate condition before the false guidance system can be safely addressed. And finally, the Eden, which requires all 7 components to be in sufficient health before the crossing can be safely attempted. This hierarchy is not a moral ranking, it is a causal sequence. The lower components must be in sufficient condition for the higher ones to function. This is why the Sumerian therapeutic tradition did not simply address whatever symptom was most distressing to the client. It assessed the entire architecture, identified which component was most fundamental in the current presenting condition, and addressed that component first, then moved up the hierarchy as each level was stabilized. This is the most sophisticated model of psychological and spiritual health ever produced, and it was developed in a civilization that, according to the consensus of contemporary archaeological thought, should not have been sophisticated enough to produce it. Unless, as the Sumerians said, they were taught. The thing about the NAM-LU that is hardest to communicate in contemporary language is the difference between what it is and what it feels like. What it is, an encoding inscribed before birth that defines the essential nature of the individual. What it feels like, nothing. Or more precisely, it feels like everything that you think of as obviously, inevitably, and undeniably yourself. The things about yourself that you never had to learn to feel. The inclinations and aversions and responses that were present in you before you were old enough to remember. The quality of your attention before it was shaped by experience. The characteristic angle at which you meet the world. The NAM-LU does not feel like a special thing because it is not a special thing in the sense of being unusual or remarkable. It is the most ordinary thing about you. It is the background against which everything else is a foreground. It is so foundational that the Sumerians compared it to the ground itself. Invisible, taken for granted, and absolutely essential for everything that grows on top of it. The difficulty is that most people, by the time they are old enough to reflect on themselves, have accumulated so many layers of ME overlays, so many conditioned responses and adopted identities and social roles and trauma adaptations, that the NAM-LU has become inaccessible to direct awareness. Not absent, inaccessible. They cannot feel the ground because they have never stood on bare ground. They have always been standing on something built on top of the ground, and they have mistaken the construction for the ground itself. The Sumerian concept of what we might call spiritual crisis, though the Sumerians would have found the word spiritual too vague and too separated from the practical, was specifically this: the moment when the construction becomes so heavy or so unstable that the person can no longer maintain it and begins to feel the absence of the ground rather than the presence of the construction. The moment when all the ME overlays and adopted identities and social roles fall away or fail, and what remains is the terrible, disorienting, and ultimately liberating experience of touching the NAM-LU directly. Terrible because what the NAM-LU feels like when encountered without the buffer of the construction is unbearably simple, unbearably particular, unbearably itself. All the complexity of personality and role and acquired knowledge and social positioning is stripped away, and what remains is something that feels almost embarrassingly basic, almost too small, almost too naked to be the essential self. But this is, according to the Sumerians, precisely correct. The NAM-LU is not complex. It is the ground. Complexity emerges from it, but is not it. And the encounter with the NAM-LU in its naked form, which is what every genuine mystical experience in every tradition ultimately produces, is not an ascent to the complex or the transcendent. It is a descent to the ground. It is the return to the most basic level of what you are. From that ground, rebuilt with proper attention to the NAM-LU's actual nature, rather than the construction that has accumulated on top of it, the soul architecture can function in the way it was designed to function. The ME can be authentic to the encoding rather than overlaid on it. The ZI-UDUG connection can be direct rather than mediated through layers of construction. The lamma can calibrate to the genuine signal of the NAM-LU rather than to the noise of the adopted identities. And eventually, if the work is done with sufficient honesty and consistency, the Eden can activate in the presence of the genuine ground rather than in the presence of a construction that would collapse under the pressure of the crossing. This is why the mystical traditions of the world agree, across their vast differences in language and practice and theological framework, on one thing. The path goes through simplification rather than through complexity, through subtraction rather than through addition, through the removal of what is not genuinely you in order to find what genuinely is. The Sumerians did not find this remarkable. They expected it. Because the Naam Lu Ulu was inscribed as the simplest possible version of the self, the essential encoding before all the additions of experience and role and adaptation, and the path back to it is always the path of removing what has been added since. This does not mean returning to infancy. The Gidam holds the accumulated experience of a lifetime, and that experience is valuable. The ME that have been authentically developed rather than externally imposed are genuinely one's own and worth keeping. The knowledge and skills and relationships that have been built in genuine alignment with the Naam Lu Ulu are part of the flourishing life, not obstacles to it. What is to be removed is specifically what contradicts the Naam Lu Ulu, the adopted identities that are not genuinely oneself. The ME overlays that were installed by conditioning or trauma rather than chosen in alignment with the essential encoding. The behaviors and responses and beliefs that have accumulated as protective strategies rather than as genuine expressions of who one is. This is specific. It is diagnostic. It requires the ability to distinguish, in one's own behavior and response, between what comes from the ground and what sits on top of it as construction. This ability is itself a product of the soul architecture work. It develops as the other components are maintained. It becomes clearer as the Lama reconnects and the Zi-Udug signal becomes more accessible, and the Gidam becomes more coherent. The Sumerians called the development of this ability by a word that translates approximately as refinement, the refinement of the self. Not in the social sense of becoming more polished or more sophisticated, but in the metallurgical sense, the removal of what is not the essential material through the application of sufficient heat. Life, according to the Sumerians, provides the heat. The work of the soul is to remain in the fire long enough for the refinement to complete. I want to address something that has been implicit throughout this presentation, but that deserves to be made explicit, because it is the thing that most directly challenges the worldview of the contemporary secular West. The Sumerians believed in a structured cosmos, not simply an ordered cosmos in the scientific sense, a universe governed by laws of physics that can be discovered and described. A structured cosmos in the sense of a cosmos organized by beings with intentions, purposes, and projects. A cosmos in which the laws of physics are real but are not the deepest level of reality. A cosmos in which what looks like random chance from the perspective of the physical domain is, from the perspective of the divine domain, the working out of specific intentions over specific timescales. This belief is not unique to Sumer. Every pre-modern civilization held a version of it. The modern secular West is, in the long history of human thought, the outlier. The position that the cosmos is a physical system without inherent purpose, that consciousness is an emergent property of brain tissue, that there are no beings with intentions operating at a cosmic level, that what happens to individuals is ultimately the product of physical causation alone. This position has been held by a significant portion of the educated West for only about 300 years, and it has never been held by the majority of even that population. What makes the Sumerian version of cosmic structure distinctive is not its existence, but its specificity. The Sumerians did not simply believe in gods in a vague theological sense. They believed in specific beings, with specific characters, and specific projects operating in specific domains, with specific tools, and specific limitations. They described these beings with the same kind of precision they brought to everything else. The Anunnaki were not omnipotent. They disagreed with each other. They made mistakes, they had preferences and antipathies, they could be outmaneuvered. They operated within a cosmic framework that was not entirely of their making and that they were navigating as well as managing. This is a much more sophisticated picture of the divine than anything that the major monotheistic traditions have been willing to offer, because it does not require the divine to be perfect. It requires the divine to be real and capable and knowledgeable and operating with intentions, but not omniscient, not omnipotent, and not infallibly wise. The gods of Sumer make mistakes that have serious consequences for the beings they are responsible for. Enlil's decision to send the flood was understood by many of the other Anunnaki to be a mistake, a disproportionate response to an annoyance. Enki's decision to warn Atrahasis was understood by Enlil to be a betrayal of the Divine Council's decision. The aftermath of the flood, the compromise that allowed humanity to survive under changed conditions, was the result of a negotiation between beings with different interests and different assessments of the situation. This is politics. Divine politics, but politics nonetheless. and it places the human being in a cosmos that is not simply ruled by a perfect authority whose inscrutable decisions must be accepted, but operated by a council of beings whose decisions are the product of their varying interests, knowledge, and assessments, and who are, as a consequence, open to being influenced. The Sumerian temple practice was not simply worship in the sense of submission to divine authority. It was communication. The rituals were understood as transmissions, as messages to specific divine beings containing specific content from specific human beings making specific requests or reports or offerings. The gods were expected to respond. Not always as requested, not always immediately, and not always in ways that were comfortable, but to respond, to engage, to take the human communication into account in their ongoing management of the cosmic order. This is a very different kind of prayer than the prayer taught in contemporary religious institutions. Contemporary prayer is generally understood as a one-way communication, a transmission from the human to the divine that may or may not be heard, and that the prayer has no reliable way of assessing the receipt of. The divine, in most contemporary theological frameworks, does not answer. It may work in mysterious ways. It may have its own plan. But the human has no reliable access to the divine response and no reliable feedback mechanism. The Sumerian priests had feedback mechanisms. They had specific methods, specific ritual technologies, specific altered states of consciousness, and specific trained perceptual abilities that allowed them to assess whether their communication had been received and what the response was. The divination traditions of Mesopotamia, which are among the most elaborate and systematic ever developed, were the feedback mechanisms. They were not fortune-telling in the popular sense. They were methods for reading the responses of the divine council to human communications and actions. We need not take a position on whether these methods actually worked. We can note that the people who used them believed they worked, that they acted on the information they produced, and that their civilization lasted for nearly 3,000 years, which is not nothing as a record of practical utility. But what is worth noting, regardless of one's position on the literal efficacy of Sumerian divination, is what the practice implies about the Sumerian view of the cosmos. It implies that the cosmos is communicative, that information flows in both directions between the human and the divine, that the divine is responsive to human action and capable of transmitting information back to humans through observable patterns in the physical world, that the relationship between human beings and the structured cosmos they inhabit is interactive rather than passive. This view of the cosmos is, in fact, more consistent with the findings of quantum mechanics than the classical Newtonian view of the cosmos as a deterministic mechanical system. The observer is not passive in quantum mechanics. The act of observation affects the system being observed. Information is not simply a property of the physical system, but a fundamental feature of reality at the most basic level. The cosmos is communicative in ways that the classical view could not accommodate and that the quantum view begins to suggest. The Sumerians were not quantum physicists, but they lived in a cosmos that they understood to be interactive, responsive, structured by intentions, and communicative at every level. And that understanding produced a civilization that, by the standards of its time, and by any standard of intellectual achievement, was extraordinary. Perhaps there is something to learn from the fact that the civilization that produced the most complete description of the human soul was also the civilization that understood the cosmos as a structure within which those souls had both purpose and communication access to the beings responsible for that purpose. Perhaps the two things are not unrelated. There is a Sumerian text that is almost never discussed in the popular literature about Sumer, not because it is obscure or poorly preserved, but because what it says is so straightforwardly strange that most writers about ancient history do not know how to handle it. It is called the Instructions of Shuruppak. Shuruppak is one of the antediluvian cities in Sumerian tradition, one of the places that existed before the flood. The text is presented as the wisdom of a father, Shuruppak, to his son, Ziusudra, who is the Sumerian version of the flood hero known in later traditions as Noah. The father gives the son advice before the flood comes. Most of the advice in the Instructions of Shuruppak is completely ordinary moral guidance. Do not deceive. Do not be lazy. Treat your family well. Manage your household properly. Respect those who deserve respect. Avoid those who deserve avoidance. The kind of advice that a thoughtful parent in any era would give. But scattered through the ordinary moral advice are passages that are not ordinary at all. Passages that only make sense if the speaker has knowledge that an ordinary human father would not have. Knowledge about the structure of the cosmos. Knowledge about the nature of the soul. Knowledge about the relationship between specific behaviors and the maintenance of specific soul components. One passage describes what happens to the lama when certain kinds of dishonesty are practiced. Not general dishonesty, but specific kinds of deception in specific relational contexts. The Lamma does not simply depart in a general sense when the person is dishonest. It departs in specific ways in response to specific violations of specific soul architecture principles, and the passage describes this with enough precision that a Ashipu who read it would recognize the diagnostic language immediately. Another passage describes the effect on the Zu-Dug connection of certain kinds of social relationships. Specifically, relationships in which the person has agreed to be something other than their Naam Lu Ulu requires. Relationships founded on performance rather than authentic expression. The Zu-Dug, according to this passage, cannot maintain its connection to the physical person when the physical person is consistently presenting a false version of themselves in their primary relationships, because the Zu-Dug is the double of the authentic self, and the authentic self is not being expressed in those relationships. This is psychologically sophisticated in a way that only makes sense if the speaker understands the 8-component soul architecture. A person who did not know about the Zu-Dug and its properties would not know to warn their son about the effect of inauthentic social relationships on the Zu-Dug connection. They would simply say, "Be honest." The instructions of Shurapak says something more specific. Be honest because specific dishonesty has specific effects on specific soul components that have specific consequences for the quality of your life. This is instruction, not merely wisdom. It is the transmission of technical knowledge in the form of parental advice, which may be the most natural form for such transmission. Not a lecture, not a text. A father telling his son, before the catastrophe that will change the world, what he needs to know about what he is and how to take care of it. The flood came. Ziusudra survived. And the instructions of Shurapak were preserved in the Sumerian textual tradition, eventually written down by scribes who recognized them as among the oldest wisdom texts they had, and pressed into clay alongside everything else the Sumerians thought was worth preserving. They are available in translation. They are sitting in the same libraries as everything else. They are waiting for the reader who knows enough about the 8-component architecture to recognize what they are reading. I have been presenting the soul components in a sequence that roughly corresponds to the order in which they appear in the Sumerian texts, and in which they need to be addressed therapeutically. But the Sumerians also describe the soul components in a spatial arrangement that reveals something about how they understood the relationship between them. The Z is the deepest, the most interior, the most fundamental. It is described in spatial terms as being at the center, the core around which everything else is organized. The Giddim is described as surrounding the Z, as the accumulated record that wraps around the animating core. In death, the Giddim persists precisely because it is the next layer out from the Z, close enough to the animating principle to maintain its own coherence even after the Z departs. The Naam Lu Ulu is described in the text as something like a field, not a location but a quality that permeates the entire soul architecture from center to periphery. Every component is inflected by the Naam Lu Ulu. The Z's particular quality is the Z of this specific Naam Lu Ulu. The Giddim accumulates the memories of this specific life, which is the life that this specific Naam Lu Ulu is living. The Emi are the Emi appropriate to this specific Naam Lu Ulu. Everything is inflected by the essential encoding in the way that a specific piece of ground inflects everything that grows on it. The Emi are described as occupying a layer external to the Giddim, but still internal to the person. They are the operating architecture, the patterns of response and engagement that the person uses to navigate the world. They are closer to the interface between the inner and the outer than the Giddim is. The Zu-Dug is described in a fascinating spatial arrangement. It is simultaneously present at the core, mirroring the Z, and present at the periphery, extending beyond the physical body into the domain that connects the physical and the divine. The Zu-Dug is the component that spans the most spatial distance in the Sumerian description. It is both the deepest and the most extended, both the most personal and the most cosmic. The Lamma is described as existing at the periphery of the soul and extending beyond it into the divine field. It is the outermost component, the one that reaches most fully into the non-physical domain. It is the antenna, in contemporary language, through which the individual soul receives signal from the cosmic intelligence. And the Eden is not located anywhere. The Eden, as I described earlier, exists in the movement between locations. It is the capacity for transition, not a place but a function. And its spatial description in the texts is precisely this. It is the path between the road that connects the other components to each other and to the domains outside the individual soul. The visual that this spatial arrangement produces is something like a sphere within a sphere within a sphere, with the Z at the center, the giddim surrounding it, the ME as a dynamic layer between the giddim and the outer surface of the person, the ZI-UDUG as a spanning structure from center to periphery and beyond, the Lama as the point of contact between the peripheral edge of the soul and the divine field that surrounds it, and the Eden as the quality of movement through and between all of these layers. The Naam-Lu-Ulu is not a layer in this arrangement. It is the specific character of the entire arrangement. It is what makes this particular configuration of Z and Giddim and Emi and Z-I-UDUG and Lama and Eden into this particular person rather than any other. And the UDUG Hulu, the corrupted ZI-UDUG, occupies the spanning structure in a way that inverts its function. Instead of connecting the center to the divine periphery through the authentic channel, it redirects the connection through a channel that leads somewhere else. The person with an active UDUG Hulu is not disconnected from guidance. They are receiving guidance from the wrong source, through a connection that mimics the ZI-UDUG structure, but that leads, ultimately, not to the divine field, but to something that has its own agenda for the person, and that benefits from their misdirection. The Sumerians drew pictures of this. Not the kind of pictures that survive well in clay, which is why the visual representations are less well preserved than the textual descriptions. But there are seals, cylinder seals pressed into clay to make images, that show specific configurations of divine and semi-divine beings that scholars have struggled to explain in purely narrative terms. Some of these configurations, when read through the framework of the 8-component soul architecture, become instantly legible. They are not depictions of mythological scenes. They are diagrams of the soul architecture in its various states of health and corruption, using visual conventions that the trained Ashipu would have recognized immediately as diagnostic and prescriptive images. The medicine, the theology, and the visual art of Sumer were not separate domains. They were different representations of the same knowledge, the same understanding of what human beings are, and what they need to function properly, and what happens when they fail to function properly, and how to restore them when they fall. This integration of knowledge domains is itself a mark of the sophistication of the original understanding. It is what you find in every tradition that has preserved substantial portions of the original Sumerian knowledge. The refusal to separate what contemporary culture has separated into theology, medicine, psychology, art, and science. The understanding that these are all descriptions of the same thing, the human being in relationship to the cosmos, approached from different angles and represented in different media, but describing the same structure. The fragmentation of knowledge into disciplines, the modern academic inheritance, is itself a product of the same process that fragmented the soul system. When the integrated knowledge was broken into pieces and distributed among competing institutions, each piece became the property of a different institutional tradition, and the connections between the pieces were lost. The priest held the theological piece. The physician held the medical piece. The artist held the visual piece. The philosopher held the conceptual piece. And none of them, working in their separated domains, could any longer see what the Sumerian specialist could see, which was the single system that all the pieces described. The reconstruction of that integrated view is the work of this generation, not because the work has not been attempted before. The Renaissance was an attempt. The Romantic movement was an attempt. The various schools of depth psychology in the 20th century were an attempt. The contemporary integration of indigenous knowledge with Western science is an attempt. Each attempt has moved the reconstruction forward, and each has been partially absorbed and partially resisted by the institutional structures that benefit from keeping the knowledge fragmented. But the clay tablets are still there. The most complete version of the integrated knowledge, imperfect, fragmentary, damaged by time and loss, but still more complete than any other source, is still there. And it is more accessible than it has ever been, available to anyone with an internet connection and the motivation to find the translations and the patience to read them with the kind of attention that they require. I want to close with the descent of Inanna one more time, not to summarize what I said earlier about it, to say something I did not say earlier. The descent of Inanna is the story of a goddess who decides, for reasons that the text never fully explains, to go to the underworld. She prepares carefully. She tells her minister Ninshubar that if she has not returned within 3 days, Ninshubar should go to the gods and ask for help. She passes through the 7 gates, surrendering at each gate one of her divine attributes. She arrives in the underworld naked, stripped of everything. Ereshkigal kills her. She hangs on a hook. 3 days pass. Ninshubar goes to the gods as instructed. Most of them refuse to help. Enlil refuses. Nana refuses. Only Enki responds. Enki creates two small beings from the dirt under his fingernails and sends them to the underworld with the water of life and the plant of life. They find Inanna's body, apply the life-giving substances, and she is restored. She ascends through the 7 gates, recovering her divine attributes at each gate. And then the story takes a turn that most people do not expect. When Inanna returns to the living world, she is not alone. The underworld has a price. The rule is that no one leaves the realm of Ereshkigal without sending a replacement. Inanna must choose who will take her place in the underworld. She returns to the world, accompanied by demons from the underworld who will claim her chosen replacement. She goes to the city of Sumer and looks at her people. Those who have been mourning her absence, who have been grieving and waiting and praying for her return, these people she passes over. She cannot bear to give them to the demons. But when she arrives at the great apple tree and finds her husband Dumuzi, the shepherd king, seated in splendor, dressed in his finest clothes, apparently unconcerned about her absence, she stops. She gives the demons Dumuzi, her husband, her beloved. The one who was supposed to be mourning her and instead seems to have taken her absence as an opportunity to enjoy his own power. The story is usually interpreted as a story about marriage, about betrayal, about Inanna's anger at Dumuzi's apparent indifference, and it is all of those things. But it is also something else. Inanna has just returned from the underworld. She has crossed the Eden. She has been through the complete dissolution and the complete restoration. She has the full Gudug perspective, the view from the between, the knowledge of what both domains are and what they require. And what she sees when she returns is a person who has been given the gift of her absence, the gift of the space her death and absence created, and who has used that space not to develop but to consolidate. Not to grow more fully into the Naam Lu Ulu, but to sit more comfortably in the social role. The apple tree is a symbol of the physical domain's pleasures and powers, and Dumuzi is resting in that symbol rather than using the time of Inanna's absence to do the inner work that her presence usually demanded of him. Inanna has crossed the threshold. She has developed the Eden, she has returned as a Gudug, and she cannot take with her into her renewed life someone who has refused the development that her absence made possible. This is not cruelty. It is cosmological necessity. The person who has crossed and returned cannot simply return to the same relationships and the same arrangements as if the crossing had not happened. The crossing changes the person in ways that are not negotiable, and the relationships that cannot hold the changed person must be changed themselves, or they must end. Dumuzi is not condemned to the underworld forever. The text, in its longer versions, describes a negotiation in which Inanna arranges for Dumuzi to spend half the year in the underworld and half the year above ground. His sister Geshtinanna volunteers to take his place for the other half. This arrangement, which produces the cycle of seasons, is usually interpreted as a seasonal myth, and it is. But it is also a description of the minimum threshold crossing that Dumuzi must undergo as a consequence of Inanna's fuller crossing. He cannot remain unchanged. He must have his own partial crossing, his own time in the between. The full crossing remains beyond him, at least in the version of the story that has survived. But the partial crossing, the seasonal descent and return, is the minimum accommodation that a person in relationship with a Gudug must make to the reality that the Gudug has discovered. The descent of Inanna is not a myth about ancient Mesopotamian religion. It is a description of what happens to relationships when one person in the relationship crosses the threshold and the other does not. When one person develops the Eden and the other has not. When one person has access to the Gudug perspective and the other is still operating entirely within the constructions of the ordinary social world, the relationships must change. They must change because the changed person can see things that the unchanged person cannot see, and the relationships that were built before the crossing cannot accommodate the full truth of what the changed person now knows. Not because the changed person is superior, because they are different in a specific and non-reversible way, and the difference requires the relationships to change. The Sumerians wrote this down. They wrote it in one of their most beautiful and most frequently copied texts, the one that has more surviving copies than almost any other in the corpus, the one that was taught in the Adaba, the scribal schools, as a fundamental piece of Sumerian literature. They thought it was important. They thought it was important for a civilization built on the understanding that the soul has an architecture, and that architecture is designed for crossing, to know what happens after the crossing, what you bring back, what you must leave behind, what you must renegotiate, what the world looks like through the eyes of a person who has crossed and returned. Inanna is not a character in a myth. She is the demonstration, written in story, so that it can be remembered and transmitted and understood by people who have not yet crossed but who will. The demonstration of what it costs, and what it gives, and why the crossing, despite the cost, is what the architecture is for. This is what no religion teaches, not because they do not want to. Some of them do want to, somewhere in their mystical lineages, somewhere in the practices of the people who have gone deepest into their traditions and found there something that the tradition itself could barely contain. They do not teach it because the full version of it, the 8-component version, the Sumerian version, with all its technical specificity and its unsentimental cosmological politics and its description of the Anunnaki as fallible beings with mixed motives and its insistence that the soul's deepest purpose is a crossing that no institution can perform for you and no belief can substitute for. That full version is incompatible with the institutional structures that have organized human spiritual life for the past 3,000 years. The full version says, the architecture is in you, the encoding is yours. The double is waiting for you to recognize it. The calibration mechanism restores when you are genuinely yourself. The crossing opens when the preparation is complete. No intermediary, no authority, no credential, no salvation from outside, no prayer that substitutes for the work, no belief that replaces the crossing, just the 8 components, properly maintained, doing what they were designed to do, in a clay vessel, between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And wherever you are now, the land between the rivers is inside you. The project is ongoing, the tablets are read.